She rode into a town that had already decided she wouldn't leave standing. A woman alone, a folder of documents, and a man with enough power to make both disappear. What happens next will make your blood run cold, because Elena Mercer didn't come to Black Ridge Crossing to make friends. She came to prove that her father's land was stolen, his signature forged, and his death quietly convenient. But powerful men don't give back what they've taken. They bury the truth, break the witnesses, and burn the evidence. The question was never whether Victor Hale would try to stop her. The question was whether she'd let him. If this story has you hooked already, stay with us until the very end, and drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The stage line didn't stop in Black Ridge Crossing so much as surrender to it. The driver hauled back on the reins at the edge of a rutted main street that seemed to have been laid down by someone who'd given up halfway through the planning, and the wheels ground to a stop in a cloud of dust so thick it tasted like chalk. The horses were lathered and bad-tempered. The two male passengers inside had already disembarked at the previous stop, which left only one person still sitting with her back straight and her hands folded over a leather satchel in her lap. Elena Mercer waited until the dust settled slightly before she moved. She was 31 years old, though most people who met her for the first time tended to underestimate her by a decade until she opened her mouth. She wasn't a large woman. She wasn't particularly imposing. What she was precise, in the way she dressed, in the way she moved, in the way her dark eyes scanned a room like she was already cataloging everything that might be used as evidence later. She wore a wool traveling coat the color of dried pine needles, sensible boots worn soft at the heel from years of walking courthouse floors, and her hair was pinned back in the kind of arrangement that suggested she'd done it herself in poor light, and didn't particularly care whether it looked fashionable. What she carried mattered more than how she looked. The leather satchel contained 6 months of work: survey maps, testimony affidavits, registration certificates, ledger copies, and, most importantly, a folder of original documents that she'd pulled from 3 different county archives across 2 territories. She'd spent her own savings to do it, slept on uncomfortable trains and in cheaper accommodations than she was accustomed to, eaten when she remembered to. Her father had been dead for 14 months. His land had been transferred to a man named Victor Hale within 6 weeks of the funeral. The transfer documents bore her father's signature. Her father had been dead for 3 weeks before those documents were filed. She knew it. She could prove it. And she had come to Black Ridge Crossing to do exactly that. The driver dropped her trunk from the roof with somewhat less care than she'd have preferred, and she climbed down from the stage without waiting for assistance. The street was busy in the mid-afternoon way of frontier towns. Not frantic, but purposeful. People moving between the general store and the post office and the feed merchant with the economy of motion that came from having too much to do before dark. A few people glanced at her. Nobody offered to help with the trunk. She stood there for a moment, taking inventory. Main Street ran roughly north to south. 2-story buildings on both sides, most of them wood-framed, some with false fronts that made them look grander from the road than they actually were. A land registry office, smaller than she'd hoped, sat between a barber shop and a hardware concern. A hotel on the north end. A saloon with fresh paint that didn't match the age of the rest of the building. A marshal's office. Dark windows. Whether that meant nobody was home or nobody was bothering, she couldn't yet tell. She picked up her trunk herself and started toward the hotel. She got a room without incident. The woman at the desk, middle-aged, sharp-eyed, hair the color of iron filings, had taken her payment and handed over a key with the efficiency of someone who'd seen too many travelers to bother with pleasantries. The room itself was small and smelled faintly of cedar and old smoke, but the lock on the door worked and the window looked out over the alley rather than the street, which suited Elena fine. She didn't need a view. She needed a surface to work on. She unpacked her satchel with the care of someone arranging surgical instruments. The documents went in a specific order on the small writing desk, chronological, with the forged transfer papers on top where she could see them. She'd looked at those papers so many times over the past 6 months that she could have reproduced them from memory. She'd studied the signature until she understood, in a way that was almost physical, what was wrong with it. Her father had been a meticulous man, a surveyor by training, a record keeper by disposition. He'd written in a particular way, the capital letters slightly backward slanting, the middle letters of long words compressed, a habit he'd developed in his 30s that was as distinctive as a fingerprint once you knew to look for it. The signature on the transfer documents had the right letters in the right order, but it had been copied by someone who'd studied the signature itself rather than understanding the hand that had made it. The pressure was wrong. The angles were wrong. She knew it the way she knew her own face in a mirror. The problem was knowing it and proving it were two different things. And the gap between them was exactly the kind of space where powerful men built themselves comfortable homes and dared anyone to knock on the door. Victor Hale had been knocking down doors in Blackridge Crossing for 11 years. She'd done enough background inquiry to understand what she was walking into. He'd arrived with capital at a moment when the territory was still figuring out its own legal architecture, and he'd moved fast, buying land, lending money at terms people couldn't meet, acquiring defaulted properties, and cultivating relationships with whoever held official positions in the county. He wasn't the marshal. He wasn't a judge. He didn't hold any title that would make him obviously the man in charge. He didn't need one. She sat at the desk and opened the transfer documents again, even though she knew them by heart. Sometimes reviewing what she already knew was less about learning new things and more about reminding herself that she was right, that the ground beneath her feet was solid, that what she'd come here to do was possible. It was a useful habit, especially in places like this. She made the mistake of going to the saloon. Not a mistake in the way she'd been warned about by the iron-haired woman at the hotel desk. Women don't go in there alone, miss. It's not... But in the sense that Elena had known the saloon was where the significant conversations happened in a town like this. And she'd wanted to get a sense of the social architecture before she walked into the land registry office the following morning. She needed to understand who talked to whom, who deferred to whom, whether there was anyone in the room who didn't belong to Victor Hale. She walked in at 6:30 in the evening. The Cross and Timber Saloon was larger inside than it looked from the street, the kind of place that had been expanded pragmatically over the years, additions tacked on as the town grew without much thought for aesthetics. Long bar on the left, tables filling the center, a small stage at the far end that might have been used for music at some point, but currently held only a piano that needed tuning. The air was the usual compound of tobacco smoke, whiskey, and the particular human smell of people who worked hard in the sun all day. About 40 people, mostly men, a handful of women, a card game going at the back table, noise at a conversational level. Not rowdy, not quiet. She found a table near the wall and sat down, setting her satchel in her lap. She wasn't trying to be inconspicuous. A lone woman walking into a frontier saloon was not going to be inconspicuous, but she kept her posture neutral and her eyes moving. A woman in an apron came to take her order. Mid-40s, broad shoulders, hair escaping from its pins in a way that suggested a long shift. She had the unhurried manner of someone who'd seen enough that very little surprised her anymore. "Evening," Elena said. "Coffee, if you have it, and whatever's hot. Beef stew and cornbread's what we got left." The woman's eyes moved across Elena's face with a quick assessment of someone deciding how much of a problem this might be. "You just come in on the stage?" "This afternoon." "Staying long?" "Long enough to do what I came to do." The woman's mouth did something that wasn't quite a smile. "You might want to keep that kind of talk to yourself while you're figuring the place out." She said it without malice, more like advice. "I'll get your coffee." Elena watched the room while she waited. The card game at the back table involved 4 men she didn't recognize, a cluster of working men near the bar, 2 men at a table near the window who were talking in the way people talk when they want to look casual and aren't. She noted them and kept looking. She was so focused on the back of the room that she almost missed Victor Hale coming through the front door. She wouldn't have known him if she hadn't found a physical description in a letter from her father's former surveying partner, a man named Aldous Webb, now retired to Albuquerque, who'd written her a careful account of what he'd observed in Blackridge Crossing and suggested she proceed with extreme caution. "Hale is tall," Webb had written, "well-dressed, the kind of man who smiles at you while deciding what you're worth." That matched. Hale was perhaps 50, with the particular well-maintained quality of a man who'd had money long enough to stop thinking about it. Dark coat, clean hat, boots that had been recently polished. He moved through the saloon the way a person moves through a space that belongs to them, not rushing, not performing, just occupying it with a certainty that was more territorial than anything obvious. He was accompanied by two men who weren't trying to look like anything except what they were. Elena kept her face neutral and looked back down at the table. She shouldn't have had the folder with her. She knew that afterward. She'd pulled it out in the stagecoach out of habit, the compulsive need to review, to make sure everything was in order, and hadn't thought to put it away before she came inside. It was the kind of error that only gets made when you're tired and running on 6 months of sustained anxiety, but understanding why you made a mistake doesn't unmake it. Hale's path through the room brought him close enough to her table that she could hear the low murmur of his conversation. She kept her eyes down. The folder sat open in front of her, not the most sensitive documents, just the outer layer, survey maps, and a registration index, but it was enough. "I don't believe I know you." She looked up. He was standing at the edge of her table, one hand on the back of the empty chair across from her. His smile was the kind that reached his eyes without actually arriving there. "I'm a guest at the hotel," she said. "Elena Mercer." "Hale," he said, not offering a first name. "Victor Hale." He let the name settle for a moment, testing whether she recognized it. "And what brings Miss Mercer to Blackridge Crossing?" "Land business." His eyes dropped to the folder on the table. She watched him take it in, the survey headers, the registration numbers. She couldn't tell from his expression what he recognized, but something shifted fractionally. "Land business," he repeated. "Whose land?" "That's a matter I'll be discussing with the county registry office," she said. "Good evening, Mr. Hale." He looked at her for a moment longer than was comfortable. Then he pulled the chair out, not to sit, just to move it slightly, a small gesture of casual authority, and pushed it back. "You should know," he said pleasantly, "that I have a strong interest in the land records in this county. Most of the significant holdings passed through my office at one point or another." He paused. "I wouldn't want anyone to waste their time on a misunderstanding." "I'm not here about a misunderstanding," Elena said. The smile stayed where it was. "Well, I'm sure we'll have occasion to talk further." He nodded once, in the way a man nods who isn't asking permission, and moved on toward the back of the room. Elena kept her hands flat on the table until she was certain they were steady. The coffee arrived. The stew arrived. She ate without tasting much of it, watching the room from under lowered eyes, while her mind ran calculations she'd been running for months. She'd been seen. She'd been identified. The folder, even the outer layer of it, had been observed. He'd recognized something or guessed something, because men like Hale spent their lives reading rooms and reading people, and a woman alone with survey maps in a town where he had significant land interests was not a detail he was going to ignore. She needed to move faster than she'd planned. She was still working through what that meant when the door opened again and Hale came back in. He hadn't gone far. Maybe just outside, maybe just to collect his thoughts, or maybe to send one of his men somewhere and come back with a particular purpose. She registered the change in the room's quality, the subtle drop in noise level, the way a few people near the door adjusted their posture, and looked up just as he crossed toward her table again. This time, he wasn't smiling. "I've been thinking," he said, stopping beside her. He didn't pull out the chair this time. He stayed standing, and the difference in height was intended to mean something. "About what kind of woman rides into a town alone and sits in a saloon looking at official documents?" "The kind who has legal business," Elena said. "The kind who's been asking questions," he said, "in other towns, about property that doesn't belong to her anymore." Her stomach went tight. He'd been watching longer than she'd realized. She kept her face still. "The Mercer property transferred legally," Hale said. "I have the paperwork." "I've seen your paperwork," she said. He looked at her for a moment. Something in his expression had changed. Not the smile exactly, but something behind it. The pleasant part was gone. "Miss Mercer," he said, and his voice dropped just enough that it was meant for her and not the room. "I've been kind to people in this town for a long time. I've been less kind to people who come in from outside thinking they understand something they don't." He let that sit. "I'd strongly encourage you to take whatever stage comes through day after tomorrow and go back to wherever you started." "I appreciate the advice," Elena said. She should have stopped there. She knew it as she opened her mouth. But she was tired and she was angry, and she'd been sitting on 6 months of careful patience that had apparently come to an end. "Your paperwork has a problem," she said, "a fairly significant one, and a territorial judge is going to agree with me." The room didn't go entirely quiet, but it went quieter. Hale stared at her. Then, without any particular escalation or visible transition, he reached down and struck her across the face with his open hand. Not a staged gesture, not calculated for the room. It was the reflexive strike of a man who'd used physical intimidation for so long that it had become automatic. The thing you did when someone said something that couldn't be allowed to stand. The blow caught her across the cheekbone and rocked her sideways in the chair. The folder fell, papers scattered. The coffee cup tipped and shattered on the floor. The room froze. It went so completely still that she could hear the fire in the stove at the back wall. She could hear the click of the card game's chips stopping mid-shuffle. She put her hand to her face, automatic response, nothing she'd decided, and looked up at him. Hale was standing with his hand at his side, and something in his expression suggested he'd surprised himself slightly. But only slightly. He was mostly waiting to see what the room would do. The room did nothing. It just held its breath. This was the part, Elena understood with a kind of cold clarity, where people in a town like this had learned to look at their boots. Where the bartender found something to do at the far end of the bar. Where the card players remembered they had cards to look at. She'd expected it, intellectually. She'd told herself she was prepared for it. Being prepared for something and experiencing it were, she was learning, completely different things. She was reaching down for the scattered papers, with her hand still shaking slightly, though she was willing it not to, when she heard the chair. It was a specific sound. The scrape of a wooden chair pushed back from a table with deliberate slowness, not sudden, not aggressive. Just the sound of a man who'd decided to stand up and was doing it at the pace he'd chosen. She looked toward it without meaning to. The man who stood was sitting at a table to her left that she'd categorized and dismissed earlier. Solitary drinker, late 30s, dark coat, not part of any obvious group. He'd looked like the kind of man who was there to drink quietly and not be involved with anything. She'd marked him as low relevance. She'd been wrong about that. He was tall, not broadly built, but with the kind of economy of movement that comes from a body that's learned to be efficient rather than impressive. He had a weathered face that might have been handsome at one point and had settled into something more interesting, irregular, with lines around his eyes that hadn't all come from smiling. He was carrying a revolver in a holster on his right hip that he hadn't reached for. He stood there for a moment, looking at Hale. "Gideon," Hale said. The word had a warning in it, delivered with the familiarity of men who'd been navigating around each other for a long time. "Victor," the man said. Just the name, like he was identifying something. He walked toward them with the same deliberate, unhurried pace of someone who wasn't afraid of how long it took to get there. He stopped between Elena's table and Hale, positioning himself sideways, facing neither of them entirely, giving both of them his peripheral vision. "You're in my establishment," Gideon Cross said. He had a flat, even voice. Not loud, not particularly quiet either. "I'm aware of where I am," Hale said. "Then you're aware of my policy about how customers get treated inside it." "She's not. She's sitting at a table that's paying for coffee and supper," Cross said. "That makes her a customer." He tilted his head slightly. "Same as you." Hale looked at him for a moment. Then he looked at the room, a slow scan, the way a man checks the room when he's deciding whether his position is strong enough to push back. The room was watching, not with the frozen blankness of before, with something more complicated. The bartender had straightened up slightly. The woman with the apron was standing at the edge of the room with a stillness that wasn't fear. Cross still hadn't touched his revolver. His hand wasn't near it. But there was something about the way he stood that communicated, without any of the usual telegraph of violence, that the hand could be near it very quickly. "We'll speak tomorrow," Hale said. He directed it at Elena, not at Cross, a last attempt to maintain the balance of the confrontation. "Think carefully tonight." He walked out. His two men followed him. The door swung shut. The room exhaled. Elena set her hand flat on the table and focused on keeping her breathing even. Her cheek hurt in a specific, insistent way that she was trying to set aside while she gathered the papers from the floor. Some had slid under the adjacent table. She reached for them without looking up. A pair of boots appeared at the edge of her vision. Cross crouched down and picked up 3 papers that had gone furthest, carefully, without looking at the content on them, which she noticed and filed away. He placed them on this table beside her. "Thank you," she said. He nodded once and stayed where he was, not hovering, but not leaving either. "Elena Mercer," she said. "Gideon Cross." He tilted his head toward the room. I own the place. I gathered. He was quiet for a moment. Outside, she could hear the sound of horses moving down the street. Hale and his men, she estimated, heading wherever they went when they left. She listened until she couldn't hear them anymore. You're not from here, Cross said. Denver, she said. Originally Cheyenne. Land records? She looked at him directly for the first time. How did you know that? The documents you were looking at. He indicated the folder without touching it. Survey maps. Registration index. The folder's well worn enough that you've been carrying it for a while. He paused. And Hale doesn't usually hit women in public. He usually just has conversations with them. The fact that he hit you means you said something that scared him. Elena was quiet for a moment. He stole my father's land, she said. I can prove it. Cross looked at her with an expression that was very difficult to read. It wasn't sympathy exactly. It wasn't skepticism either. It was the expression of someone who'd heard similar things before and was trying to determine which category this particular instance fell into. He's had this town for 11 years, Cross said. I know. The marshal reports to the county commissioner who owes his position to Hale. I know that too. The land registry. I know about the land registry, she said, with perhaps more edge than she'd intended. I've spent 6 months learning exactly how the machinery works and exactly where it's broken. I didn't come here because I thought it would be easy. He was quiet. She pressed her fingertips against her cheekbone and then made herself stop. Why did you stand up? She asked. It wasn't your business. Cross considered the question with the air of a man who took questions seriously, even when they were uncomfortable. It's my place, he said finally. What happens in my place is my business. That's not a complete answer. No, he agreed. It's not. He picked up his glass from where he'd left it on the floor. He'd apparently been carrying it when he stood up, which she hadn't noticed, and straightened. Are you hungry? The stew's decent, and yours seems to have ended up mostly on the floor. She looked down. The bowl had landed upright but was empty. The stew was in fact on the floor. For a moment she almost laughed. The absurdity of it. The stew on the floor, the cheek that was probably bruising already, the papers that were back in order except for the one that had apparently disappeared under the neighboring table for good. Sitting in a town that had already decided she was a problem, talking to a man she couldn't quite read. Yes, she said. I'm hungry. He went to the bar and said something quietly to the bartender. Then he came back and sat down at the table across from her, not the chair Hale had touched, the other one, and set his glass down and didn't say anything. The woman with the apron, Marta, she'd learn later, brought new coffee and a fresh bowl of stew without being asked, and set them down with the particular efficiency of someone who'd been making decisions about people for a long time. She's all right, Marta said quietly to Cross. It might have been about Elena. It might have been about something else entirely. Looks like it, Cross said. Elena ate. The stew was in fact decent. Outside, the main street of Blackridge Crossing carried on its business in the autumn dark, and somewhere in a building she hadn't identified yet, Victor Hale was thinking about the woman who had told him his paperwork had a problem. She needed to work tonight. What? She told Cross that, directly and without preamble, when she'd finished eating. I need a space to work tonight, somewhere with a table and light. The hotel room is small and the desk is inadequate. She paused. And I'd rather not be somewhere where Hale knows exactly where I am. He looked at her. She had noticed he had a habit of looking at people for a beat longer than most people did. Not staring, just completing the thought before he answered. She found it less irritating than she'd expected to. There's a back room, he said. I use it for accounting, mostly. Table's big enough, and there's a lamp that works. He tilted his head. I won't ask what you're working on. I'll tell you anyway, she said, eventually, if you're willing to hear it. One thing at a time. He led her through the saloon, through the noise and the tobacco smoke, past the card game that had restarted, past Marta, who gave Elena the specific kind of look that meant she'd formed an opinion but wasn't going to share it yet, and through a door at the far end that led into a narrow corridor and then into a room that was exactly what he'd described. Plain, functional, a large table stacked with ledgers and receipts, 2 oil lamps, a window that faced the alley. He cleared the ledgers to one side without being asked. Locks on the inside, Mum, he said. Door from the corridor also locks. I'll be in the main room until close. Thank you, she said. He started to leave. she said without entirely meaning to. Why did Hale call you by your first name? The way he said it, it wasn't how you speak to someone you don't know. Cross stopped with his hand on the door. We have history, he said. What kind? He looked back at her. Something in his face had closed slightly, not hostile but careful. The kind that's complicated to explain. You said one thing at a time, she said. I did. Something moved across his face that might have been a smile, except it was too tired to quite get there. Get your work done. We can talk about history some other time. He left. The door clicked behind him. Elena sat down at the cleared table and opened her satchel with hands that were steadier than they had been an hour ago. She arranged the documents in their order, the order she'd developed over 6 months, the sequence that told the story from beginning to end in a way that was airtight and logical and true. The forged transfer papers went in the center. Around them, the original survey records from her father's estate, the county registration index with its protocol numbers, the affidavits from the 2 witnesses she'd located in Cheyenne, and the accounting ledger she'd found in her father's personal papers, his own ledger, his handwriting throughout, recording 20 years of careful land management up until 6 weeks before his death. She'd been looking at these papers for 6 months. Tonight, for the first time, she had a table big enough to lay them all out at once. She set her hand in the center of the table, looked at everything arranged around it, and took a long, slow breath. Victor Hale had called her father's land transfer legal. She was going to show him what legal actually looked like. She picked up the first document and started to work. But outside, the sounds of the Cross and Timber Saloon carried through the walls in a muffled, irregular way. Voices, the piano making a renewed attempt at something in waltz time, boots on the floorboards. Occasional laughter, the particular ambient sound of a place doing its ordinary business in the evening, the kind of sound that had nothing to do with land fraud or forged signatures or the careful plans of powerful men. She worked by lamplight until close to midnight. The cheek still hurt. She checked it in the small mirror above the wash basin in the corner. A bruise was forming, purple-edged, exactly where she'd expected. She could feel the heat of it when she touched it, which she'd decided to stop doing. What she found in those hours of working, spreading the documents across the table in sequences she hadn't tried before, was what she'd suspected but couldn't quite articulate until she had the physical space to see it. The fraud wasn't just the forged signature. The forged signature was the end of a much longer story. The protocol numbers on the transfer registration, the sequential identifiers that every land filing received, were wrong. Not wrong in an obvious way. Not wrong in a way that anyone would catch if they were looking at a single document, but wrong in a way that became visible when you arranged 5 years of registration side by side, because the sequence had gaps, and the gaps corresponded to dates when specific properties had changed hands under circumstances that, when she cross-referenced them with the financial records she'd obtained from the Cheyenne Territorial Archive, involved the same pattern. Low on default. Rapid transfer. Paperwork filed at a county level rather than territorial, which kept them out of the higher-level indices. Her father's property was not the first. It was the most recent. She sat back in her chair and looked at what she'd found and understood, with the specific quality of comprehension that came after a long search, that she'd been right to come here, but that she'd also underestimated the scale of what she was walking into. This wasn't one forged signature. This was a system. She was still sitting with that understanding, turning it over when there was a quiet knock on the door. "It's Cross," his voice said from the other side. She got up and unlocked the door. He looked at the table, all the documents spread out, the careful arrangement of papers that now covered the entire surface, and his face was carefully neutral. "Place is closed," he said. "Thought I'd let you know before I locked up the main room." He looked at the papers once more, a look that was controlled, not curious. "You found something." It wasn't a question. "More than I was looking for," she said. He nodded slowly. His eyes moved to her cheek, the bruise she could feel even when she wasn't touching it. He didn't say anything about it. "There's a room upstairs," he said. "Storage, mostly. Has a cot and a lock. Better than the hotel tonight, if you're concerned about—" He paused. "If you want the option." She thought about it for less than 2 seconds. "I'll stay," she said, "if it's not an imposition." "It's not." He looked at the table again. I'll bring coffee in the morning. He turned to go. Cross, she said. He stopped. The history you have with Hale, she said. I need to know if it means you can't be involved in what I'm doing here. I'm not asking you to be involved, but if there's a reason the association would be a problem, I should know it. He stood with his back to her for a moment. The history with Hale, he said, is that 10 years ago, he tried to acquire the property this saloon sits on by the same method you're describing. His man came to me with paperwork I was supposed to sign. He turned back. I didn't sign it. What happened? I made it clear, he said, that I was not going to sign it, and that if anything happened to me or my establishment, the Territorial Marshal's office in Denver would receive a package of documents that Hale would not want them to see. She looked at him. Did you actually have documents? I had some. Something crossed his face. Not as many as I implied, but it worked. He left me alone after that. Cross's mouth settled into a line that wasn't quite wry and wasn't quite bitter. I think he figured the trouble was worth more than the property. Or he needed you to stay, she said. A town without a saloon in good standing is a different kind of town. Cross looked at her with the same expression he'd used earlier, the completing the thought look. Maybe, he said. The history doesn't make you a problem, she said. If anything, it makes you a resource. I'm not... He stopped, considered. I'm not a lawman. I'm not in a position to be a protector. I don't need a protector, she said. I need people who aren't afraid of Victor Hale. She gestured at the documents on the table. Because what I found tonight is bigger than my father's land, and if I'm going to present it to a territorial judge, I'm going to need people who'll still be standing when I do. Cross looked at the papers on the table, not reading them, just acknowledging that they existed. Get some sleep, he said. We can talk in the morning. He left. She locked the door and went back to the table. She started working again. Outside, Blackridge Crossing was quiet in the way of small towns at midnight. Not truly silent, but reduced, the dark pressing down on the main street and the false-fronted buildings and the land registry office with its smaller-than-hoped windows and whatever was inside it that she hadn't yet been able to examine. Tomorrow, she thought. She's arranged the last documents in their sequence and looked at what they told her. Tomorrow, she would start pulling on the thread. Victor Hale had spent 11 years building a machine designed to take what other people had earned through patient work and careful record-keeping and the kind of stubborn, ordinary persistence that built lives in hard places. He'd built it to be invisible, to look, at any individual point, like a legal transaction conducted through proper channels. He'd built it for people who had no one to notice the pattern. He'd made the mistake of building it in a time when Elena Mercer existed, and when her father existed, and when her father kept his own accounting ledger in his own careful hand with his signature, his real signature, the one with the backward slanting capitals and the compressed middle letters, at the bottom of every page. She could feel the bruise on her cheek like a pulse. She looked at the documents. She was not afraid. She was angry, and anger, in her experience, was a much more useful thing. The coffee Cross brought in the morning was strong enough to be impolite, which was exactly what she needed. She'd slept maybe 3 hours on the cot in the storage room upstairs, fitful, interrupted sleep, the kind where you keep surfacing because your brain refuses to let go of something. She'd woken before dawn with the particular alertness of someone who hadn't really stopped working, just moved the process somewhere less conscious. The bruise on her cheek had darkened overnight. She'd seen it in the small mirror above the basin, a deep purple-green mark that ran from her cheekbone toward her eye, ugly and specific. She'd looked at it for a moment, then washed her face and gotten dressed. When Cross knocked and came in with 2 mugs, he set one in front of her without comment. He glanced at her face once, the cheek, and then looked away, and she appreciated that more than she would have appreciated sympathy. Registry office opens at 8, he said, sitting down on the other side of the table with his own mug. I know. She wrapped both hands around the mug. I won't go there first. He waited. If Hale has someone in that office, and I believe he does, then walking in there this morning with what I found last night puts the evidence at risk before I've had time to understand the full scope of it. She looked at the papers still arranged on the table, exactly as she'd left them. I need to understand the pattern completely before anyone who works for him knows I've found it. Cross drank his coffee. What did you find? She told him. Not everything. Not the specific documents, not the details that would only matter to someone who understood land registration protocol, but the shape of it. The sequential gaps in the filing numbers, the pattern of loan defaults that preceded transfers, the way it had been structured to stay invisible at the territorial level by keeping transactions confined to county-level records. He listened without interrupting, which was another thing she noted about him. Most people, when presented with complicated information, started asking questions before you finished the sentence. Cross held his questions until she was done. "How many properties?" he asked. "At least 7 that I can confirm. Possibly more. I'd need access to the county registry going back further than 5 years to be certain." "The county registry," he said, "which is run by a man named Silas Pruitt." The name was familiar. She'd encountered it in the registration index. "What do you know about him?" Cross set his mug down. "Pruitt's been the county registrar for 9 years. He was appointed by the commissioner." He paused. "He's not a bad man, from what I can tell, but he's in a position where being honest is expensive." "Meaning Hale has something on him." "I don't know that for a fact, but you suspect it." "I suspect it," he said. She looked at the papers. A man who wasn't bad but couldn't afford to be honest was a specific kind of problem, the kind that could go either way depending on what you put in front of him and how much pressure was on the other side. "I need someone who can tell me where the gaps in the public record are without tipping off the wrong people," she said. "Is there anyone in this town with access to land records who isn't connected to Hale?" Cross was quiet for a moment. He turned his mug slowly on the table, thinking. "Margaret Cade," he said finally. "Who is she?" "She runs the boarding house on 4th Street. He looked up. "Her husband was a surveyor. He died 4 years ago. She keeps his old records because she's the kind of woman who keeps things." He paused. "She also doesn't like Victor Hale." "Why not?" "Because her husband surveyed a property 2 years before he died that Hale later acquired through one of his transfers. She thinks the survey was used as the basis for falsifying the boundary lines." Cross looked at her steadily. "She's never been able to prove it, but she's held on to everything Tom Cade ever wrote down." Elena set her mug on the table. "Take me to her," she said. Margaret Cade was a compact woman of about 60 who answered the door of her boarding house on 4th Street with the expression of someone who'd gotten used to being cautious about who she let in. She looked at Cross first, a look that was assessment rather than welcome, and then at Elena, and then at the bruise on Elena's cheek. "Come in," she said, without preamble. The boarding house was a different world from the saloon. Scrubbed floors, curtains at the windows, the smell of bread from somewhere in the back. Margaret led them into a sitting room that also served as a small parlor, and she sat across from them without offering tea or coffee first, which told Elena that she considered this a different kind of conversation. "You're the woman Hale hit last night," Margaret said. It wasn't a question. "News travels," Elena said. "In a town this size, news travels before you've finished making it." Margaret's eyes were a faded blue that had the quality of color that had been tested and held. "What do you want?" "Your husband's survey records, specifically anything related to properties that changed hands between 1878 and 1882. Margaret looked at her for a long moment. "Why?" "Because I think your husband surveyed properties that were subsequently acquired through fraudulent transfers," Elena said. "And if his records show what I think they show, they'll help me build a case that's strong enough to put in front of a territorial judge." Margaret was quiet. Her hands, folded in her lap, were the hands of someone who'd done physical work her whole life. Strong, slightly rough, the knuckles enlarged from years of use. "Tom knew," Margaret said finally. "He didn't know everything, but he knew something was wrong. He came home one night, this was about 3 years before he died, and he told me he'd been hired to survey a property boundary, and when he submitted his report, certain measurements had been altered before the registration." She stopped. "He asked the registrar about it. Pruitt told him it was a clerical correction and that his services were no longer needed." "Did he keep his original survey notes?" "He kept everything," Margaret said. "Every measurement, every calculation, every note he wrote in the field." Something moved across her face. "I kept everything after him." She stood up and left the room. They heard her footsteps going toward the back of the house, then upstairs, then returning. She came back carrying a wooden box that had probably once held tools and now held papers. Folded survey sheets, notebooks with water-stained covers, loose pages covered in the dense, small handwriting of a working professional. She set the box on the table between them. "Tell me what you need," Margaret said. "No." They spent 4 hours in Margaret Cade's sitting room. Elena worked through Tom Cade's survey notebooks, with the concentration of someone reading a language they'd spent years learning, understanding not just the words, but the texture of them, the place where they deviated from what they should have said. Margaret sat across the table and answered questions when Elena had them, and Cross sat near the window and said very little, but his presence had the quality of ballast, something steady that kept the room from listing. What Elena found in Tom Cade's notebooks was what she'd hoped and feared in equal measure: original survey measurements that contradicted the registered boundary lines on at least 4 of the 7 properties she'd flagged the night before. In each case, the original survey placed the property's water access, springs, creek frontage, wells, within the original owner's boundaries. In each case, the registered version had adjusted the lines slightly, not dramatically. Not in a way that would catch your eye if you weren't measuring carefully. Just enough to put the water access on the adjacent parcel, which in every case had subsequently been acquired by Hale. "Water," Margaret said when Elena laid it out. "The railroad needs it," Elena said. "Not just land for the trackbed, they need water stations every 15 to 20 miles. If you control the water rights along the proposed route, you control what the railroad pays for access." "And Hale knew the route before anyone else did," Cross said from near the window. He wasn't looking at them. He was watching the street. "He's been on good terms with the Territorial Railroad Commission for years." Elena looked at him. "You knew about the railroad." "Everyone knows about the railroad," he said. "People just don't know what to do with the information." She turned back to the notebooks. "I need to borrow 3 of these," she told Margaret. "The 1879 entries and the 2 notebooks from 1881. I'll make copies and return the originals within a week." Margaret looked at her. "What happens if Hale finds out I gave them to you?" "I'll do everything I can to make sure he doesn't know where they came from," Elena said. "But I can't promise you certainty. I can only tell you that what's in these notebooks is evidence that a federal court will take seriously, and that if this goes the way it should, his ability to intimidate anyone in this county will be significantly diminished." She paused. "I'm not going to lie to you and tell you there's no risk." Margaret was quiet for a long moment. "Tom would have wanted someone to use them," she said. "He died angry about this." She looked at the notebooks on the table. Angry and quiet about it, which is a miserable way to carry a thing. She pushed the notebooks toward Elena. "Take them," she said. Marta Voss had worked at the Cross and Timber for 6 years. She'd come to Black Ridge Crossing from Omaha following a husband who hadn't lasted and a plan that hadn't worked out. And she'd landed at the Saloon because Cross had posted a notice, and she'd needed the money, and it had turned out to be the most permanent arrangement in a life that had specialized in impermanent ones. She knew everyone in town by their drink and their mood and the things they said when they thought no one was paying attention. She found Elena in his back room that afternoon, copying survey measurements into a new notebook in her careful, precise hand, and she stood in the doorway for a moment before saying anything. "You need to know something," Marta said. Elena looked up. "Frank Dolan, he's one of Hale's men, was in here at noon asking questions about you." Marta leaned against the doorframe with her arms crossed, not performing casualness, but genuinely comfortable in her own body in the way of someone who'd learned not to waste energy on posturing. Asking when you'd come in, who you'd talk to, how long you sat in the back, trying to make it sound like idle talk. "What did you tell him?" "That I couldn't keep track of every customer, and he should ask the man who owned the place." Marta paused. "He didn't ask Cross." Elena set her pen down. "Why not?" "Because Frank Dolan is not entirely stupid, and he knows that asking Gideon Cross for information you don't already have is a good way to let Cross know you want it." Marta's expression was dry. "He's scared of Cross, same as most of Hale's people are. They just don't like to admit it." "What's the history there?" Elena said. "Cross told me they have history, but he wasn't specific." Marta came into the room properly and sat in the other chair, with the air of someone making a considered decision. "What Cross told you is his to tell," she said. "But what I can tell you is that 10 years ago, when Hale tried to take this property, there were 3 men who came to encourage Cross to reconsider his position." She paused. 2 of them left on their own. 1 had to be helped out. Another pause. Hale decided the property wasn't worth the trouble. Cross mentioned documents, Elena said, something he held over Hale. That too, Marta said. But the documents came after. The first thing was Cross making it clear that the physical part of the negotiation was also available to him. She looked at Elena with the direct appraisal of someone who said what she meant. He's not looking for trouble. He genuinely isn't. But he's not going to let someone walk through his door and take something that's his. Elena thought about the way Cross had stood up the night before. The deliberate pace of it, the complete absence of theater. He stood up for me, she said. I wasn't his. Marta's expression shifted into something more complicated. No, she said, you weren't. She let that sit without explaining it, which was its own kind of explanation. Tell me about Silas Pruitt, Elena said. Marta's face did something that wasn't quite a grimace. Pruitt's a decent enough man who made a decision about 5 years ago that he's been paying for ever since. She pulled at a loose thread on her apron without pulling it free. Hale came to him. This is what I've heard, not what I know, with evidence that Pruitt had altered some filing dates on a personal property transaction. Small thing, relatively, but enough to end his career and his reputation if it came out. Hale offered to keep it quiet. In exchange for cooperation on certain registrations, Marta's voice was flat. That's how it goes. Once you've done the first thing, you've done the first thing. The next one's easier to ask for. Elena was quiet. Does he know what he's been helping build? She asked. The scope of it? I think he knows enough to be afraid of knowing more, Marta said. A man who knew enough to be afraid. That was a different problem from a man who was simply corrupt. Fear was an emotion you could work with if you approached it correctly. Greed was harder. Fear at least meant someone still had a conscience somewhere underneath it. One more thing, Marta said, standing. There's a man who comes in on Tuesday nights, has for about 2 years, name's Chester Ames. He's a wire operator at the telegraph office. She looked at Elena steadily. He drinks more than he should and talks more than he means to, and about 6 months ago he said something to me that I've been thinking about since. She paused. He said Hale sends a wire to Denver every time a new land transfer completes, to the same address. A property investment office that Chester says doesn't appear in any business register he's ever been able to find. Elena stared at her. You've been sitting on that for 6 months, she said. I didn't know what to do with it, Marta said. Who do you tell something like that in a town where Hale owns the people you'd tell it to? She looked at Elena with something that was equal parts helplessness and relief. Now I'm telling you. Tuesday was 2 days away. Elena worked. She established a rhythm that was partly practical and partly defensive. Mornings spent reviewing documents in the back room with the door locked. Afternoons making careful appearances in the town that would suggest she was still there but give nothing away about what she was learning. She ate at the saloon. She spoke to people. She let the town see her and form conclusions about what she was doing that weren't entirely accurate. The bruise on her face faded from purple toward yellow-green, which somehow made it more visible rather than less. People looked at it. Most didn't say anything. A few, mostly women, mostly the ones who'd been around long enough to understand what the bruise meant, met her eyes in a particular way when they passed her on the street, the look of people who would have liked to say something and had learned through experience not to. She thought about those looks at night, when she was back at the table with the documents. She was building a picture, not just of the fraud itself, but of the ecosystem that had allowed it to persist, the network of small accommodations and strategic silences that kept a man like Hale in place not because people admired him, but because opposing him seemed more costly than tolerating him. It was a familiar structure. She'd seen versions of it in other places, smaller and larger. The mechanism was always the same. Identify the people who might object, make the cost of objecting visible, and let human nature do the rest. What made it work was the isolation of each person's knowledge. Pruitt knew his part. The wire operator knew his fragment. Margaret Cade knew what Tom's notebooks meant, but had no leverage to act on it. Each of them held a piece of something they couldn't quite complete alone. She was building the complete picture. On the second day, Cross came into the back room in the early afternoon with a look on his face that meant something had happened. Hale's man Dolan was at the hotel this morning, he said. Talked to the desk clerk for about 20 minutes. They went through my room. Elena said. It wasn't a guess. Most likely. Cross sat down across the table. You didn't leave anything important there. I don't keep anything important there. She'd understood from the first morning that the hotel room was a visible location, useful for appearances, not for storing evidence. What else? Hale had a conversation with the marshal this afternoon, Cross said. Lasted about half an hour. About me? I'd assume so. She looked at the documents in front of her. How much authority does the marshal actually have? Not technically, in practice. Cross considered it. In practice, he does what Hale indicates without Hale having to ask directly. He's not malicious, he's just accustomed to the way things work. Would he arrest a woman on fabricated charges? Cross was quiet for a moment. I don't think he'd enjoy it, he said finally. But I think he'd do it. She'd been afraid of that. How long do I have before Hale decides that's the next move? Depends on how scared he is. The more he thinks you found, the faster he'll move. Cross looked at her. How much have you found? She told him. Not holding back this time, the full scope of it, the water rights, the railroad connection, the pattern across 7 properties, what Tom Cade's notebooks confirmed about the altered survey lines. Cross listened with the same complete attention he'd given her the first morning, and she watched his face as she talked, watching for the specific kind of surprise that told you someone was hearing something new rather than something they'd already half suspected. When she finished, he sat with it for a moment. The Railroad Commission, he said. Someone on it tipped Hale about the route, she said. I can't prove who yet. But the wire address Marta told me about, the Denver Investment Office, that's the thread. If I can identify who's on the other end of those wires, I have the connection between Hale and whoever inside the commission was feeding him information. Chester Ames, Cross said. Tomorrow night. Cross nodded slowly. He was looking at the far wall in the way of someone whose mind was moving through something. You need the registrar, he said. Pruitt. You need him to confirm what the filing numbers tell you. A judge will listen to an expert in land registration over documents alone. Cross looked at her. And you need him to tell you what he was asked to do and when. He's terrified. He is, Cross said. But terror and guilt together sometimes add up to something useful if you give them enough room. What do you mean? He leaned forward slightly, the first time in several days she'd seen him move toward something rather than staying contained. Pruitt comes in here on Friday evenings, has a drink, eats supper, mostly sits alone. He did it before Hale had anything on him, and he kept doing it after, which I think is either habit or the specific kind of thing you hold on to when the rest of your life has gotten compromised. Cross looked at her steadily. Friday evening. Let me introduce you. Elena thought about it. Not as someone investigating him, she said. No, as someone who wants to talk about county land records in general. Let him figure out for himself that you already know things. Don't push, just let him understand that the shape of what you know has a space where his testimony would fit. It was, she thought, a more sophisticated approach than she'd expected from a saloon owner. She said so without quite meaning to. Cross looked at her with an expression that was somewhere between amused and resigned. I wasn't always a saloon owner, he said. She waited. I wasn't always a lot of things, he said, which was the kind of answer that was technically responsive without being informative, and his tone suggested he'd done that on purpose. She didn't push, she filed it. Tuesday night, Chester Ames came in at 7:15 and sat at the bar. He was a slight man in his late 30s with the indoor pallor of someone who worked by artificial light and the fidgeting hands of someone who lived with low-grade anxiety as a permanent condition. He ordered whiskey, not the good bottle, the middle one, which told her something about his finances, and he sat with his shoulders hunched in the way of a man who was trying to take up less space than he actually occupied. Marta served him. Elena sat at a table nearby with a cup of coffee and Tom Cade's survey notebook open in front of her, looking at it without reading it, listening. She let Chester Ames have 2 drinks. Then she moved to the bar, 2 stools down from him, and ordered more coffee and asked Marta, in a voice designed to carry just far enough, whether the telegraph office in Blackridge Crossing connected to the Denver line or only to the territorial relay. Marta, without missing a beat, said she didn't know and suggested Elena ask someone who'd know better. Chester Ames looked sideways at her. It connects to Denver Direct, he said. It was automatic, the response of someone whose professional knowledge was activated before social caution could intervene. Good to know, Elena said, with the specific friendliness of someone who wasn't pushing. I need to verify some wire records as part of a land dispute. Historical records, nothing current. She paused. Does the office keep copies of outgoing wires? Something happened in Chester Ames' face, a small, rapid calculation. For how long? He said carefully. 5 years, say. Another calculation. He turned his glass on the bar. Officially, the office keeps records for 2 years. Anything older gets cleared. Officially, Elena said. He looked at her for a moment. The whiskey was making him slightly more honest than he'd intended to be. Some operators keep their own copies, he said. Personal logs. For accuracy. In case of disputes. In case of disputes, Elena said. She looked back at her coffee. That seems like good professional practice. Chester Ames was quiet for a while. He drank his whiskey. She drank her coffee. Around them, the saloon did its usual evening business, and Marta moved behind the bar with the unhurried competence of someone who knew exactly what was happening and had decided to let it happen. You're the woman Hale hit, Ames said finally. That's me. He turned his glass again. The wires went to a company called Meridian Land Holdings, he said. Very quietly, not looking at her. Denver address. I looked it up once in the business registry. It wasn't there. But you kept a copy of those wires. He said nothing. Mr. Ames, she said, keeping her voice level, I'm not going to tell you this isn't dangerous. I think you already know it is. But what I'm building is going to reach a territorial judge, and when it does, it's going to be the difference between a case that holds and one that doesn't. She let a moment pass. If Victor Hale's operation collapses, if it actually collapses legally and completely, then what he knows about you and what he could threaten you with goes with it. Chester Ames stared at the bar. The personal logs are at my house, he said. Not at the office. That's fine. I'd want... He stopped, started again. I'd want it to be clear that I kept them for legitimate professional reasons. I can work with that. He drank the last of his whiskey, set the glass down, didn't look at her. I'll think about it. He left about 10 minutes later, slightly unsteadily, buttoning his coat against the autumn night. Elena watched him go through the saloon window and then looked at the survey notebook open in front of her and thought about how much a frightened man's personal log could do in the hands of someone who knew what questions to ask the records. Marta appeared beside her and topped off her coffee without being asked. Well, she said. He'll bring them, Elena said. Marta made a sound that wasn't quite agreement and wasn't quite doubt. He's scared. Scared people do things, Elena said. Sometimes the wrong things, sometimes the right ones. Depends on whether they're more afraid of what they might lose or what they've already given up. She looked at the documents spread in front of her. In 2 days, she would sit down with Silas Pruitt, the registrar who knew where the bodies were buried because he'd been made to dig some of the holes. She would do it carefully, without pressure, letting him come to his own conclusions about what she already knew. Cross would be there. The familiarity of the saloon would help. Saloon. Outside, the dark main street of Blackridge Crossing was quiet. Somewhere down the block, a light still burned in the building she'd been told was Hale's primary office. He was awake too. He was thinking too. The difference was that she had more of the truth than he knew about, and she was still finding pieces of it. She turned the page of Tom Cade's notebook and kept working. Silas Pruitt arrived at the Cross and Timber on Friday evening at exactly the time Cross had predicted, 6:15, same table he always took. Near enough to the wall to feel protected, far enough from the bar to maintain the pretense that he wasn't really there to drink. Elena had been watching the door from the back corner of the room for 40 minutes before he walked in. She'd used the time to observe the saloon with the specific attention she'd been training herself to maintain over the past week, noting who came in with whom, who sat where, which of the regulars might report back to Hale, and which were simply ordinary people living ordinary lives in a town that had quietly normalized something corrupt a long time ago. Pruitt was a small man, 60s, with the posture of someone who'd spent decades trying to make himself less visible. His coat was well-maintained but old, the kind of old that said he'd been careful with money long enough that careful had become the habit rather than the necessity. He ordered a beer he clearly didn't intend to drink quickly and sat with both hands on the table, looking at the door less like someone expecting company and more like someone monitoring the exits. Cross came out from behind the bar about 20 minutes after Pruitt arrived. He moved across the room without appearing to have a destination, stopping at one table to say something that made two men laugh, pausing at another to refill a glass from the bottle he was carrying. When he reached Pruitt's table, he sat down with the naturalness of a man visiting a familiar acquaintance, and Elena watched Pruitt's shoulders do the small thing they did when he was trying to appear unconcerned. She gave them 5 minutes. Then she took her coffee and walked over. "Silas," Cross said, "this is Elena Mercer. She's been working out of my back room this week. Land records specialist out of Denver." Pruitt looked at her. His eyes went to the bruise, which had faded further but was still visible in the right light, and something moved through his expression. Recognition, she thought, of what the bruise meant and who had put it there. "Mr. Pruitt," Elena said, sitting down, "I've been hoping to ask you some general questions about county registration protocol. Background questions. I'm trying to understand how the filing system here works." He looked between her and Cross. A careful man's calculation. How much of this is what it seems to be? "What kind of background questions?" he said. "Sequential filing protocols mostly. The way protocol numbers are assigned when documents come in, whether there's a standard gap between filing date and registration date, how corrections get logged if errors are found in original submissions." She kept her voice even, academic, the tone of someone gathering context rather than evidence. "I come from a territorial system that does things differently, and I want to make sure I understand the local method before I draw any conclusions." He drank a small amount of his beer. "The county uses a sequential log system. Documents filed in order of receipt, each gets a protocol number that reflects the date and the sequence within that date. So if I'm looking at two documents with sequential numbers, I can determine approximately when each was filed relative to the other." "That's correct." "And if there's a gap in the sequence, numbers missing between two consecutive documents in the public record, what would account for that?" Pruitt's hands tightened slightly on his glass. It wasn't dramatic. Someone not watching carefully would have missed it. "Gaps can occur for several reasons," he said, with the measured quality of someone choosing words the way you choose where to put your feet on uncertain ground. Documents withdrawn before completion, filings that were started and not finalized, clerical errors in numbering. "How often does that happen?" she asked. "In your experience?" "Occasionally," he said. "In my review of the County Registration Index over the past 5 years," Elena said, "I found 11 gaps totaling 37 missing protocol numbers. Does that seem within the ordinary range to you, Mr. Pruitt?" The silence that followed was not long, maybe 3 seconds. But it was the kind of silence that had weight. "That seems higher than ordinary," Pruitt said finally. His voice had gone flat in the specific way that voices go flat, when the person speaking is managing something larger than the conversation they're having. "It does to me too," Elena said. She didn't push further. She let it sit there between them, and she picked up her coffee and drank some of it, and across the table Cross refilled Pruitt's glass from the bottle without being asked. A small, ordinary gesture that helped the silence feel less like confrontation and more like a pause in a longer conversation. Pruitt looked at the table. Then he looked at Elena. "Miss Mercer," he said, very quietly. "What is it you think you know?" "I think I know the shape of something," she said, "and I think you know the details that would confirm whether the shape is accurate." He was quiet for a long moment. "I have a daughter in Santa Fe," he said. It seemed like a non sequitur. It wasn't. "She's got 2 children. She doesn't know—" He stopped, pressed his lips together. "She doesn't know anything about how things have gone here." Elena looked at him. She understood what he was telling her, in the sideways manner of a man who couldn't quite say it directly. He was telling her what he was afraid of losing. He was telling her where the boundary was. "What I'm building," she said carefully, "is a case that stands on documentary evidence. Protocol numbers, survey records, registration dates, wire correspondence. When it reaches the territorial judge, it will stand without requiring anyone to have done anything other than keep honest records of what they observed." She let that sit. "If someone were to provide a sworn account of what they were asked to do," she continued, "and the circumstances under which they were asked to do it, that would strengthen the case. It might also demonstrate cooperation with a federal inquiry, which courts tend to consider when determining culpability. She paused. But the case exists without it. It's strong without it. I want you to understand that. Pruitt sat with his hands around his glass for a long time. I need to think, he said. Take the time you need, she said. I'll be here through next week. He nodded once, stood up, left most of his beer, and walked out of the saloon with the measured pace of a man trying very hard not to look like he was leaving in a hurry. Cross watched him go. He'll come, he said quietly. Maybe, Elena said. He said, I need to think. That's not the same as no. She watched the door that had closed behind Pruitt. I know, but maybe is all I have right now. The attack came on Sunday. She'd been working late, past midnight, with the lamp turned low to avoid drawing attention through the alley window. The saloon had been closed for an hour. Cross was upstairs. The main street was silent in the particular way of a frontier town's deep night, when even the last holdouts have given up and gone home. She heard it before she understood what it was. A sound from the front of the building that was wrong, that didn't fit the catalog of ordinary nighttime noises she'd been unconsciously maintaining. Not loud, just wrong. She was on her feet before she'd consciously decided to stand. She'd developed the habit, over the past week, of keeping certain documents on her person. The most critical originals, her father's authentic accounting ledger, the 2 original survey maps with Tom Cade's signature, and the comparison document she'd prepared showing the forged signature against authenticated examples, were in a flat leather case she kept inside her coat during the day. At night, when she worked, she set the coat on the chair beside her rather than hanging it on the wall. Old habit from years of working in courthouses and registry offices where things went missing. She picked up the coat and put it on. The sound came again, closer, and now she identified it. The front door. Not someone knocking, someone working the lock. She gathered the remaining documents from the table. Not all of them, not the bulk of the copies she'd been making, but the originals of Tom Cade's 2 most critical notebooks and Chester Ames' personal wire log, which he'd delivered to Cross the previous afternoon with shaking hands and the expression of a man jumping off a cliff he'd been standing at the edge of for years. She put them inside her coat with the leather case. The back room had 2 exits, the corridor door to the main saloon and the alley window. She went to the corridor door first and opened it a crack. She could see light under the front door of the saloon, a moving light, someone with a lantern. There were 2 of them, she thought from the sound, maybe 3. She went to the alley window, slid it up, and went through it in a way that was undignified and scraped her shoulder on the frame and landed her in the alley mud with rather more impact than she'd have preferred. She didn't stop to assess the damage. She stood up and moved into the deeper shadow of the alley wall and stood there breathing, listening. Inside the cross and timber she could hear movement. Then, the sound that turned her stomach, the deliberate sound of papers being moved, scattered. She'd left duplicates on the table. The duplicates could be replaced, but she heard something else underneath the shuffling, something liquid, and she understood before she smelled it. Lamp oil. She moved, not away from the building, toward the exterior stairs that ran up the back of the building to the upper floor. She took them 2 at a time in the dark, estimating placement by feel, and she banged on the upper door hard enough that her knuckles split on the wood. Cross? She kept her voice low but urgent. Cross, wake up. They're burning the building. It took maybe 4 seconds. Then the door opened and Cross was there, fully dressed, which suggested he hadn't been asleep or hadn't been asleep long, and he took in the situation from her face before she said another word. How many? He said. At least 2, maybe 3. They have lamp oil. He was already moving past her, down the stairs, and she followed because standing on the landing wasn't a useful option. He went around the side of the building rather than through it. She understood why when she smelled the smoke starting from the front, a thin smell still, the oil just catching, and came around to the front street from the north, approaching the building's entrance from the side where the angle gave him cover from the doorway. The front door was open. He didn't hesitate. He went in low and fast, and Elena stopped at the doorway because going in with him would have made her an obstacle rather than a help. And she watched through the doorway as Cross crossed the main floor of the saloon toward where 2 men were in the process of realizing that the fire they'd started was smaller than expected because they hadn't had as much time as they'd needed, and that the man coming toward them was not someone they'd prepared for. The revolver came out, not as a gesture, as a statement. "Get out," Cross said. He said it the way he said most things, level, without unnecessary volume. It was somehow more frightening for the lack of theater. One of the men dropped the lamp he was holding. The other one, Dolan, she could see from the doorway, Hale's man who'd been asking questions about her at the hotel, looked at Cross and made a calculation that took about 1 second. "This isn't your fight," Dolan said. "It's my building," Cross said. Dolan looked at the revolver. Then he looked at Cross's face. Whatever he found there settled the calculation in a particular direction. They left. Not running. Men like Dolan didn't run if they could help it, but moving with purpose toward the back door, and Cross let them go, which Elena understood was the right choice because 2 men in custody with injuries meant a complex situation, and right now a simple one was better. The fire was small. The oil had caught on the edge of the table in the back room and a section of the floor, and Cross had a water bucket behind the bar that he'd apparently thought about before now because he had it in his hand inside of 30 seconds. Elena found a second bucket near the kitchen, and they put it out between them in a way that left them both coughing from the smoke and her coat wet at the hem and the back room's floor scorched in a 2-foot circle, but intact. They stood in the damaged room in the aftermath, both of them catching their breath. The papers on the table, the duplicate copies she'd left, were scattered and some were burned at the edges. Not destroyed, most of them were readable, but it had been close enough. "The originals?" Cross said. She put her hand to her coat. The documents inside were dry. "Here." He looked at her for a moment. "You went out the window." "I went out the window," she confirmed. His mouth did something that wasn't quite a smile but was adjacent to it, the expression of someone who is relieved and finds the specific method of that relief slightly absurd. "Smart," he said. "There was mud," she said. "I can see that." He looked at her coat, at the mud on her skirt, at her scraped hand. "Are you hurt? Shoulder?" "Nothing serious." She looked at the scorched floor. "He's done calculating. He's moving to destroy the evidence because he's realized I've found more than he thought." "Yes, which means I'm out of time." "Yes," Cross said again. He set the empty bucket down. He had a smudge of smoke on his face, and his hair was disordered from sleep, and he looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen from him before. Something less controlled than his usual, something that had been shaken loose by the urgency of the last 10 minutes. "Elena, how long until you have everything you need?" She thought about it honestly. 3 days, maybe 4, if Pruitt comes through. "Then we do it differently," he said. "We don't wait for the judge to come to town. You present what you have now, publicly. Everything you found in front of witnesses so that the evidence is known to enough people that destroying the documents can't erase what's already been said out loud." She stared at him. "That's risky. I know. If I present before I have Pruitt's testimony, if you wait for Pruitt and Hale burns this building to the ground with everything in it, you have nothing," Cross said, "and Pruitt may never come if the alternative looks like it's failing." She thought about it. She didn't want to agree because agreeing meant abandoning the careful completeness she'd been building toward. But she'd spent enough time with evidence to know when a partial case presented to witnesses became its own kind of evidence, one that couldn't be burned. "Not everything," she said finally. "The most damning specifics. The protocol number gaps, the survey discrepancies, the wire correspondence. Enough that a room full of people understands what's been done, even if they don't understand all of it." "When?" She looked at the scorched floor, at the scattered papers, at the window she'd gone through in the dark. "Tuesday," she said. "Give me 2 more days." What? She didn't sleep the rest of that night. She used the time instead to make 3 complete copies of the most critical documents and gave 1 set to Margaret Cade the next morning, 1 set to Marta to be kept somewhere in the saloon that wasn't the back room, and kept 1 set herself. If anyone tried to burn 3 separate locations in a town of this size, they would run out of time and discretion before they ran out of targets. She also wrote a letter which she gave to Chester Ames to wire to the Territorial Marshal's office in Denver. Not a complaint, not yet, but a notification that evidence related to potential federal land fraud was being assembled in Blackridge Crossing and that a copy of documentation would follow within the week. She didn't know if it would bring anyone, but it created a record that she'd sent it, which was a different kind of protection. On Monday afternoon, Silas Pruitt came to the back room. He didn't knock. He just tried the door, found it unlocked, and came in, and stood there looking at the scorched floor with an expression that said he'd heard what had happened and it had confirmed something he'd already been telling himself. "Sit down," Elena said. He sat. He looked at the documents on the table with an expression she recognized. The specific expression of a person who is looking at something they've been afraid to see and finding that the actual sight of it is less terrible than the imagining had been. "I altered 14 registration filings between 1878 and 1882, Pruitt said. Without preamble, without negotiation, just the facts delivered in the flat voice of a man who'd made a decision and was executing it before he could reconsider. In each case, I was given specific instructions about what changes to make and what documentation to file. I was told what to say if questions were asked." He paused. "I was never told directly who the ultimate beneficiary was, but the instructions came from Victor Hale." Elena said nothing. She was afraid that if she said anything, even something affirming, it might break the particular state he was in, the state of a man who'd gotten himself to the edge of something and was getting it out while he still could. "The property belonging to a man named Arthur Mercer," Pruitt continued, "was the 14th. The signature on the transfer document was not genuine. I don't know who produced it. I was told it was in order and to file it accordingly." He looked at her directly for the first time since he'd sat down. "I knew it wasn't right. I filed it anyway." The room was very quiet. "I was afraid," he said. Not as an excuse, as a statement of fact. "I know," Elena said. "That doesn't make it—" "No," she said. "It doesn't, but it makes it human." She set her pen down. "Will you put this in writing? A sworn statement signed and dated?" He looked at the table. "Yes." "Today?" "Yes," he said. "Today. Before I—" He stopped. His hands on the table were not quite steady. "Before I have time to talk myself out of it." She produced a fresh sheet of paper and set it in front of him with the pen. Then she moved to the other side of the room and stood at the window with her back to him, giving him the small dignity of not being watched while he wrote. She looked out at the alley and the slice of Main Street visible at the end of it, and she thought about her father, about the accounting ledger in her coat with his real signature on every page, the backward slanting capitals and the compressed middle letters, the evidence of a hand that had done its work carefully and honestly for 20 years. She heard the pen moving behind her. She did not turn around until he was done. Tuesday evening, the Cross and Timber was fuller than usual. Word had gotten out, how exactly she wasn't certain, though she suspected Marta was involved, that something was going to happen. People had come in with the particular alertness of a crowd that expects to witness something, filling the tables and standing along the walls and ordering drinks they were only half attending to. Elena had seen it before, in different settings, the way a community that has been suppressing something will turn out in numbers when someone finally gives them permission to watch it surface. She stood at the front of the room near the piano with her documents arranged on the table beside her, and she looked at the crowd and felt, for the first time since she'd arrived in Black Ridge Crossing, something that wasn't exactly calm, but was the thing that comes after you've been afraid long enough that the fear stops feeling like information and starts feeling like weather. Something you're present in, not controlled by. Cross was at the bar. Not beside her, not in front of her. At the bar, with his hands on the rail and his posture relaxed, watching the room with the steady attention of someone who'd decided what they were there to do and was doing it. She started talking. She didn't use legal language. She used the language of someone telling a story, because the people in the room were not lawyers and they didn't need legal arguments. They needed the narrative to be clear enough that they could hold it, remember it, repeat it if they had to. She started with the protocol numbers. She put the registration index on the table and she explained, in plain terms, what a sequential filing system was and what it meant when 37 numbers were missing over 5 years. She let the room sit with that. She watched people's faces move through skepticism toward attention, toward something harder to dismiss. She put Tom Cade's survey notebooks alongside the registered boundary documents and explained, measurement by measurement, what had been changed and what those changes meant for water access. She showed them the pattern, not just her father's property, but all 7, property by property, transfer by transfer, each one following the same method, each one adding another section of water-rich land to a portfolio being assembled for a railroad deal no ordinary citizen of Black Ridge Crossing had been informed about. She showed them the wire correspondence, Chester Ames' personal log, which he'd annotated in his own careful hand, and she explained what Meridian Land Holdings was, or rather what it wasn't: a registered business, a transparent entity, anything that could be examined. It was a name attached to a Denver address, attached to outgoing wires from Black Ridge Crossing that corresponded date by date with completed land transfers. The room was very quiet. Then she put her father's accounting ledger on the table and she opened it to the last entry, dated 6 weeks before the transfer documents had been filed, and she showed them his signature, the real one. And then she showed them the signature on the transfer documents, and she explained without elaborate rhetoric exactly why they were not the same. My father's name was Arthur Mercer, she said. He surveyed land in this territory for 22 years. He kept his accounts accurately. He did not transfer his property to Victor Hale 6 weeks before he died. She looked at the room. Someone signed his name. Someone filed the documents. Someone has been collecting water rights and profiting from fraudulent transfers while the families who lost their land tried to understand what happened to them. The back door of the saloon opened. Victor Hale came in. He had 3 men with him, not Dolan, who Elena hadn't seen since Sunday night, and he walked through the room with the same territorial quality she'd first observed, except that there was something different about it now. The room didn't part for him the way it might have a week ago. People shifted, but not with deference, with something more complicated. He stopped near the center of the room, close enough to the front that his presence was an interruption, but far enough that he hadn't yet committed to anything. "Miss Mercer," he said, his voice carried without effort. "You've been entertaining the town, I see." "I've been explaining the public record," Elena said, "which is a matter of public concern. What you've been doing," Hale said, "is presenting a collection of inaccurate documents and misinterpreted data as evidence of wrongdoing." His tone was the measured, reasonable tone of a man who'd talked his way out of things before and expected to do it again. "Land registrations have errors. Survey notes get revised. None of what you've described constitutes fraud." "Silas Pruitt disagrees with you," Elena said. Something flickered in Hale's expression. Fast. Controlled. But she'd been watching his face since she started talking, and she'd been waiting for the moment to say that name in this room, and she didn't miss it. "Pruitt filed a sworn statement this morning," she said, "describing the specific instructions he received and who gave them. It's with 3 separate people in this town, and a copy is already on its way to the territorial marshal's office in Denver by wire." The room was so quiet she could hear the fire in the stove. Hale looked at her for a long moment. His face was doing the thing that faces do when a man is recalculating in real time, finding the angles, looking for the move that restores a position that is no longer quite what it was. Then he started moving toward her. Not fast, not obviously aggressive. The kind of movement that could be construed, if anyone wanted to construe it generously, as simply crossing a room. But she knew what it was, and the room knew what it was, and the specific way people near his path leaned slightly away from him rather than making room for him was its own kind of statement about what they thought it was. She held her ground. She heard the sound from the bar. Not loud, not sudden. Just the sound of a man standing up from where he'd been leaning. Cross came out from behind the bar the same way he'd stood up from his table 9 days ago. At the pace he'd chosen, without urgency, without performance. He stepped between Elena and Hale with the same sideways placement, neither confrontational nor evasive, just present. His right hand rested at his side, not on the revolver, near it. "Victor," he said. Hale stopped. He was 2 feet from Cross. The calculation on his face had shifted into something different, the expression of a man whose next move had just become significantly more complicated than it had been. "This isn't finished," Hale said. He said it to Elena, past Cross's shoulder. "No," Elena said. "It's not. But it's going to be." The room held its breath. Hale looked at Cross for a long moment, the look of men who have been measuring each other for years and know the measure by now. Then he turned, and his 3 men fell in around him, and he walked out through the back door the same way he'd come in. The room exhaled. Elena set her hands flat on the table and looked at the documents arranged in front of her and breathed. Her heart was doing something complicated in her chest that she was going to deal with later, in private, when she had the room to herself. She looked up at the crowd, all those faces, turned toward her, some frightened and some angry, and some with the particular expression of people who have watched something shift and aren't quite sure yet what it means. "I'll be filing a formal complaint with the territorial court by end of week," she said. Her voice was steadier than she'd expected. "The circuit judge is due in the county in 3 weeks. I intend to be ready." People started talking, not quietly, with the released energy of a room that has been holding its collective breath for longer than this evening. Cross came back to where she was standing. He didn't say anything for a moment. He looked at the documents on the table, at the room, at the door that Hale had left through. 3 of his properties have mortgages with the First Territorial Bank in Pueblo, Cross said quietly. When this becomes public knowledge, when a federal inquiry starts, even informally, those mortgages are going to become complicated for him. She looked at him. "You've been thinking about the financial implications." Someone had to. He met her eyes. "You were thinking about the legal ones." She was too tired to have a particular response to that. She just nodded. Marta appeared with a glass of water. Not coffee, not whiskey, just water, and set it on the table beside the documents, and Elena picked it up and drank half of it and set it down again. Outside, somewhere down the main street, she could hear horses moving. Hale leaving, probably. Going back to the building with the late burning light to think about what had just happened and what options remained to him. She knew what remained to him. She'd been planning for it. The days after Tuesday moved differently. Not slower, not faster. Differently. With the specific quality of time that changes when a thing that has been building in secret is suddenly visible to everyone. The town of Black Ridge Crossing didn't transform overnight into something brave. That wasn't how towns worked in Elena's experience. What happened was more incremental and less cinematic. People started making small decisions that they would have made differently the week before. The hardware merchant nodded to her when she passed on the street instead of finding something to look at. The woman at the hotel desk, the iron-haired one who'd warned her about the saloon, brought hot water to her room without being asked, which she hadn't done once in the 10 days prior. Small things. The kind of small things that meant the calculation had shifted. Hale was still in town. That was the part that kept her working past midnight every night that week, kept her watching the alley window before she let herself sleep. She'd expected him to leave, to put distance between himself and Black Ridge Crossing while the situation consolidated into something legal that he couldn't easily disrupt. He didn't. He stayed in his building with the late burning light and received visitors and sent riders out and did whatever it was that men like Hale did when they were deciding which version of the future they could still afford to purchase. Cross told her on Wednesday morning over coffee that had become a standing arrangement neither of them had formally established, that Hale had visited the marshal's office twice since Tuesday night. "What does the marshal say?" Elena asked. "Marshal Tully says he's listening." Cross turned his mug in the way he did when he was thinking. "Tully's not a bad man. He's a man who's been operating in a system that made certain things easier than others for a long time, and now the system is changing faster than he'd prefer." "Will he move against Hale before the judge arrives?" "Not on his own initiative," Cross said. "He'll wait to see which way the weight falls." He looked at her. "That's not a criticism. That's an accurate reading of what he is." "I know." She drank her coffee. "As long as he doesn't move for Hale, I can work with the rest." What she was working on, in those 3 days between Tuesday's public presentation and the moment the circuit judge's arrival became something she could stop holding her breath about, was the formal documentation package. The sworn complaint, the evidence index, the chain of custody statements for every original document she'd collected. It was the kind of work she was genuinely good at, patient, precise, the construction of an argument that could be handed to someone else and would hold its shape without her standing there to explain it. Pruitt's sworn statement had to be formatted correctly. Chester Ames' wire logs had to be indexed to the specific transfer dates. Tom Cade's survey notes had to be cross-referenced, measurement by measurement, against the registered boundary documents with the discrepancies flagged clearly enough that a judge who'd never surveyed land in his life could follow the argument. She made Margaret Cade read the survey sections on Thursday morning and tell her what she didn't understand. Margaret, who had lived with a surveyor for 30 years and understood the technical content perfectly well, read it carefully and then said, "The problem isn't the content, it's this section here," pointing to a paragraph about traverse calculations, where you're assuming the reader knows what a traverse is. Elena rewrote that section 3 times before Margaret said it was clear. It was the most useful conversation she had that week. On Friday, Hale made his move against Pruitt. She found out from Marta, who'd heard it from the blacksmith, who'd been standing near enough to the marshal's office at 11 in the morning to hear raised voices. Hale had gone to Tully with a counterclaim that Pruitt's sworn statement was itself coerced, that Elena Mercer had threatened the registrar with false prosecution if he didn't sign a document she'd prepared for him, that the entire complaint was a scheme by a woman with no legitimate standing in the county to interfere with legally completed land transactions. It was, Elena thought when she heard it, a reasonably intelligent move given the available options. It introduced doubt. It made Pruitt's credibility the contested ground, rather than the documents themselves. The problem for Hale, the problem that Elena had understood from the moment Pruitt sat across from her and started talking, was that coercion was a difficult thing to allege against a woman who'd been in a room with a man, with no witnesses to the conversation, when the man himself was denying that he'd been coerced. Pruitt would need to hold. She went to his office that afternoon. He was sitting at his desk with the particular stillness of someone who has been sitting with the same thought for a long time and hasn't resolved it. He looked up when she came in, and she could see from his face that he knew why she was there. "He went to Tully," Pruitt said. "I heard. He's saying you threatened me." Pruitt's voice was careful. "He's going to say that anything I told you was under duress." "Is that what happened?" Elena asked. She kept her voice neutral. It was important that the question not sound like a challenge. Pruitt looked at her for a long moment. "No," he said. "That's not what happened." "Then that's what you say." She sat down in the chair across from his desk, the visitor's chair, worn at the armrest from years of people sitting in it with their own problems. "Silas, I'm going to ask you something, and I need you to answer it honestly." He waited. "When you wrote that statement," she said, "were you telling the truth?" He was quiet long enough that it was uncomfortable. But she'd learned over this week that Pruitt's silences weren't evasion. They were the pauses of a man who'd spent years being careful with words and couldn't turn that habit off, even when he wanted to. "Yes," he said. "Then the statement holds," she said. "Hale can allege coercion. Tully can listen to the allegation. But what you wrote is either true or it isn't, and you're the only one who knows which." She leaned forward slightly. "The question isn't whether Hale will try to discredit you. He will. The question is whether what you wrote is something you'll stand behind when he does." Pruitt looked at the surface of his desk, at the blotter, worn thin at the center from years of writing, at his hands. "I have a daughter in Santa Fe," he said again. "I know. If this goes wrong, if Hale survives this and I've given a statement against him, I understand the risk," Elena said. "I'm not going to tell you it doesn't exist." He pressed his lips together. Something moved through his face that was too complicated to name easily. Fear and shame and something older and more stubborn underneath both. "I've been doing things I knew were wrong for 5 years, he said. "I told myself each time that it was the last time, that I'd find a way to stop." He stopped. "I never found a way." "You found one now," Elena said. "You found it for me," he said. "No." She shook her head. "I gave you a reason to use the one you already had. That's different." She stood up. "The judge arrives in 11 days. I need you to still be saying what you said on Monday when he gets here. Can you do that?" Pruitt looked up at her. Something in his face had settled. Not resolved, not at peace, but settled. The way a stone settles into mud when it's finally stopped moving. "Yes," he said. 9 days later, the circuit judge arrived on the afternoon stage. His name was Clarence Alderman, and he was 64 years old and built like someone who'd spent a long career riding difficult stages to difficult towns and had the physical compactness of a man who'd learned to fit himself into uncomfortable spaces and remain functional. He had a gray beard and a reputation, which Elena had researched carefully through territorial court records, for intellectual rigor and impatience with procedural gamesmanship. He also had, according to those same records, a history of ruling against land fraud in 3 previous cases that had come before him, one of which had resulted in the arrest of a county commissioner. She'd chosen to take this to him specifically. The circuit schedule had given her 2 options, and she'd chosen Alderman because the other judge had a social connection to the Territorial Railroad Commission that she wasn't yet in a position to fully characterize. She was waiting at the stage stop when he arrived. He looked at her with the evaluating squint of a man who was figuring out why a woman was standing at the stage stop in the middle of the afternoon with a leather satchel and an expression that suggested she'd been waiting a while. "Judge Alderman," she said, "my name is Elena Mercer. I'm a land records specialist, and I've filed a formal complaint with your court regarding fraudulent land transfers in this county. I'd appreciate the opportunity to present the documentation at your earliest convenience." He looked at her for a moment. "How early," he said, "is earliest?" "This evening would suit me," she said. "If it suits you." He almost smiled. "Give me an hour to eat something," he said. "Then you can have your shot." She had 3 hours with Alderman that evening, in the back room of the hotel where he was staying, with a lamp that was better than the one in Cross's back room, and a table she cleared herself while he finished the meal he'd brought up. He read everything she gave him before he asked a question. That was the first thing she noticed about him. He read completely, rather than skimming and then interrogating, which meant that when he did ask questions, they were specific and precise and went directly to the points where the chain of evidence had gaps or places that required additional explanation. He asked about the protocol number methodology. She explained it. He asked whether an independent expert could confirm her interpretation of the sequential gaps, and she told him yes. She'd already drafted a request to a land records examiner in the territorial capital who'd agreed to review her analysis. He asked about Tom Cade's survey notes, specifically whether the original measurements could be verified by a current survey of the properties in question. She told him yes, that she'd already identified 2 licensed surveyors in the county who'd agreed to conduct verification surveys. He asked about Pruitt. "He's prepared to testify," she said. "He understands what he's testifying to and why." "He understands that his own culpability is going to be examined," Alderman said. It wasn't a question exactly. "He does," Elena said. "He's made his peace with that." Alderman looked at her over the top of the document he was holding, Pruitt's sworn statement, which he'd been reading carefully. "How'd you get him there, sis?" he asked. "In my experience, men in his position don't generally volunteer." "I gave him accurate information about what I already knew," she said, "and I gave him time to decide what to do with the fact that I knew it." Alderman looked at her for a moment. "And the man who runs the saloon, Cross, what's his role in this?" "He provided a space to work," Elena said, "and a reason for Victor Hale to reconsider the physical option at a couple of critical moments." "Has he done anything actionable?" "Nothing that isn't covered by property protection and reasonable defense of his establishment," she said. "He's not part of the complaint." Alderman set Pruitt's statement down. He looked at the documents spread across the table, the evidence index, the survey comparison, the wire logs, the registration analysis, the forgery documentation for her father's signature. "Miss Mercer," he said, "in my experience, land fraud cases in the territories come in 2 varieties. The kind where someone has bent a few rules and the evidence is complicated and the outcome is uncertain. And the kind where someone has built a deliberate system over a long period of time and left enough of a paper trail that a competent examiner can reconstruct the whole architecture." He paused. "This is the second kind." She looked at him. "Yes, the Meridian Land Holdings connection," he said. "That's going to require a separate federal inquiry. I can flag it and refer it, but resolving the Denver end of this is beyond my circuit jurisdiction." "I understand that," she said. "My primary concern is the local transfers, the restoration of the fraudulently acquired properties. That's within your jurisdiction." "It is," he said. He closed the top folder and straightened the documents in front of him with the precise gesture of a man who was also a keeper of papers. "I'll need 3 days to review the full package thoroughly. I'll schedule a formal hearing on the 6th day of my stay." He looked at her. "I'll need your witnesses available." "They'll be available," she said. He nodded once. "Get some sleep," he said. "You look like you haven't had a full night in 3 weeks." She almost told him she hadn't had a full night in 6 months. She decided against it. "Thank you for your time," she said instead. The 3 days before the hearing were the longest of the entire month. Hale moved in ways she'd anticipated and one she hadn't. He'd anticipated 2 of the business owners who'd been in the saloon on Tuesday night received visits from one of Hale's men expressing concern about their outstanding debts and the terms under which those debts might be called in. She'd heard about both visits within hours through Marta's network, which she'd come to think of as the most efficient intelligence operation in Black Ridge Crossing, operating entirely through coffee refills and the specific information carrying capacity of a woman that men habitually underestimated. The one she hadn't anticipated. Hale attempted to file a counter-complaint with Alderman, alleging that the documents Elena had submitted contained forgeries themselves, specifically that Tom Cade's survey notebooks had been altered after the fact to show measurements that didn't match the original surveys. She found out about it from Cross on the second day, over the morning coffee. She set her mug down and sat very still for a moment. "He's saying my evidence is forged," she said. "He filed the allegation with Alderman yesterday afternoon," Cross said. "He's claiming that Cade's notebooks were in his wife's possession for 4 years and could have been modified at any point." "Margaret," Elena said. He's not naming her directly in the allegation, but the implication is clear. Elena thought about Margaret Cade, the wooden box of her dead husband's notebooks, the way she'd pushed them across the table, the way she'd said Tom died angry about this, angry and quiet, which is a miserable way to carry a thing. "He's trying to make her afraid," Elena said. "Yes." She stood up. "I need to talk to Alderman this morning." Alderman received her in the same back room of the hotel with the patient attention of a man who'd expected something like this. "I'm aware of the counter-allegation," he said before she started. "I received it yesterday. I've been considering how to address it. The survey notebooks have been in Margaret Cade's possession since her husband's death," Elena said. 4 years. "I can demonstrate that the ink throughout the notebooks, including the entries Hale is claiming were altered, is consistent with aging across that period. I can also provide affidavits from 3 people who saw the notebooks before I did and can confirm the content of specific entries." "Who saw them before you?" "Margaret Cade herself. Her neighbor, a woman named Ruth Fowler, who helped her move household items when her roof needed repair 2 years ago and was present when the box of notebooks was handled." She paused. "And Gideon Cross, who'd been in her sitting room approximately 8 months ago and seen the box open." Alderman looked at her. "Cross has seen the notebooks. Margaret showed him some of the survey entries a while back. She trusted him. He knew Tom Cade." Elena met his eyes. "He can speak to the specific content of entries that were visible to him at that time and compare them to the current content. They're consistent." "That's useful," Alderman said. "Write up the affidavits. Have them ready by the morning of the hearing." She had them ready by that evening. Margaret's affidavit was 3 pages. Detailed, specific, the document of a woman who remembered precisely. Ruth Fowler's was shorter but concrete, fixing a specific date when she'd handled the box and a specific entry she'd happened to read. Cross's was a single page, careful and exact. He'd seen 2 notebook entries. He could quote portions of them from memory, and the current content of those entries was unchanged from what he'd seen. She delivered them to Alderman that night and went back to the saloon and sat in the back room with the lamp turned low and the documents stacked neatly in their folders. And she didn't work. She just sat. Cross came in around 10 o'clock and didn't ask what she was doing. He sat on the other side of the table and poured 2 glasses from the bottle he'd brought and set one in front of her. "You wrote an affidavit for me today," he said. "You witnessed the notebooks. It was relevant. I know." He was quiet for a moment. "I'm not objecting. I just wanted to say—" He stopped, started again. "You're careful about what you ask people for." She looked at him. In the lamplight, he looked tired in a way that was different from his usual controlled manner, a tiredness that had come from 2 weeks of sustained vigilance, of standing in front of things that needed standing in front of without making it about himself. "You gave me a table to work on," she said, "and coffee, and you went into the building when it was on fire." "The building belongs to me." "You went in when it was on fire," she said again. "Don't minimize that." He drank some of his whiskey. "Your father," he said. "Tell me about him." She hadn't talked about her father much, not directly, not as a person. She talked about his documents, his signature, his land. She'd used his accounting ledger as evidence. He was meticulous, she said, almost to a fault. He'd resurvey a property he'd surveyed the previous year just to make sure he hadn't made an error. She turned her glass on the table. "He argued with me once for 3 hours about whether I'd measured a boundary line correctly when I was 16 years old and helping him on a job. He was right. I had made an error." She paused. "He didn't do it to be unkind. He did it because he thought accuracy was a form of respect. For the work and for the person whose land you were responsible for getting right." Cross listened. He died without knowing what had been done to his property, she said. The transfer happened 6 weeks after his death. He never... She stopped. He never had to know. Is that a comfort or not? She thought about it honestly. Both, she said. I'm not entirely sure in what proportions. They sat in a quiet that had the particular quality of a quiet, between two people who've been through something together and have run out of the need to fill space with language. Outside, the main street was dark. 11 days she'd been in Black Ridge Crossing. She'd arrived in a cloud of stage dust with a folder of documents and a clear understanding of what she was walking into, and she'd been wrong about the scale of it but right about the essential thing, that the evidence existed, and that evidence, properly assembled and presented, was something a powerful man could not simply decide not to be true. The hearing was held in the largest room in the hotel because the town had no courthouse, which was itself a fact about Black Ridge Crossing that would change after this was over. Elena had already made a mental note about it. Alderman sat at a table at the front. Elena sat to his left with her documents. Hale sat to his right with a man named Bertram Cole, who was, apparently, the closest thing to a practicing attorney within 2 days' ride, and who had the look of someone who'd agreed to this arrangement before fully understanding what he was walking into. The room was full. Standing room along the walls, people out into the corridor. Margaret Cade sat in the second row with her hands in her lap. Chester Ames sat near the back, with the expression of a man who'd been holding his breath for 2 weeks and was still holding it. Marta was there, near the wall. Pruitt sat in a chair to the side of the room, not at the table, not in the audience, but in the specific position of someone waiting to be called. Cross stood at the back of the room, near the door. Alderman called the hearing to order with the economy of a man who'd been doing this for a long time and didn't require ceremony. Elena presented the documentation package in the order she'd prepared, starting with the structural overview, moving through the evidence in sequence, building the picture from the protocol numbers through the survey discrepancies through the wire correspondence. She'd done this enough times over the past month, in various partial versions, that the words came without effort. She knew where each piece fit. She knew which transitions needed emphasis and which could move quickly. Bertram Cole objected 4 times. Alderman overruled 3 of the objections and sustained 1, a question about chain of custody for Chester Ames's wire logs that Elena had anticipated and had documentation to address, which she provided. Then Alderman called Pruitt. Silas Pruitt walked from his chair to the seat beside Alderman's table with the pace of a man walking into something he's been dreading and has finally arrived at. He sat down. He looked at Alderman, not at Hale, which was either the result of careful coaching or his own instinct, and Elena thought it was probably his own instinct. Alderman asked him about the 14 registrations. Pruitt talked for 45 minutes. He was not dramatic about it. He didn't editorialize. He described, with the flat precision of someone giving a technical account, what he had been asked to do for each of the 14 filings, which numbers were changed, which dates were altered, which boundary descriptions were modified. He described the nature of the instructions he'd received and the form in which they'd come. He described the implicit understanding that had governed the arrangement for 5 years. He named Victor Hale each time he was asked who had given the instructions. Cole cross-examined him for 15 minutes. Pruitt's answers didn't change. When it was over, Pruitt went back to his chair and sat down and didn't look at anything in particular. Elena watched his hands, which were not entirely steady, and thought about what it cost a person to say accurate, true things about their own worst decisions in a room full of their neighbors. It cost something. She wasn't going to pretend it didn't. Alderman called a recess of 30 minutes. People moved in the corridor and the hotel lobby. Elena stood at the window of the hearing room and looked at the main street of Black Ridge Crossing and didn't think about anything specific, just let her mind run without direction for the first time in weeks. When Alderman came back, he didn't take long. He reviewed systematically the evidence as presented. The protocol number analysis, corroborated by the confirmation from the territorial capital's land records examiner, who'd reviewed Elena's methodology by wire and found it sound. The survey discrepancies, corroborated by Tom Cade's notebooks, whose authenticity had been established to his satisfaction by the affidavits of 3 witnesses and the physical examination of the documents themselves, which showed consistent aging throughout. The wire correspondence, corroborated by Chester Ames' personal logs. which contained dated entries in Ames' own hand that aligned with the transfer records and Pruitt's testimony. The transfer documents filed in the name of Arthur Mercer, deceased, bearing a date 6 weeks prior to their filing and a signature inconsistent with the authenticated examples provided by the complainant, Alderman said, are hereby found to be fraudulent. The transfer of the Mercer property to Victor Hale, recorded under Protocol number 1882-447, is void. He went through the other 6 properties with the same precision. 4 of the 7 had surviving family members or original owners who'd been located and notified. Elena had done that work herself during the documentation phase. 3 were estates with no surviving claimants, which created a different legal question that Alderman noted for the territorial court's consideration. Then he looked at Hale. Victor Hale, he said. On the basis of the evidence presented and the sworn testimony received in these proceedings, I am referring this matter to the Territorial Prosecutor's Office for criminal charges, including document fraud, filing of fraudulent instruments, and coercion of a public official. He paused. You are directed to remain in the county pending the prosecutor's office's determination of how to proceed. Marshal Tully, who had been standing near the back wall with the expression of a man watching something larger than himself come to a conclusion he'd been waiting for, straightened up. Hale sat very still. Cole said something in his ear. Hale's face went through several things in quick succession. None of them were the controlled, pleasant expression he'd been carrying since the night he hit her in the saloon. What was underneath was less composed, more ordinary. The face of a man who'd built a careful architecture over 11 years and was watching someone dismantle it with the same kind of patience he'd never extended to anyone else. He looked at Elena. Not at Alderman, not at Pruitt, not at the room. At her. She held his gaze and didn't do anything with it. There was nothing to do with it. It was just a man looking at the person who'd taken something from him, and what he'd lost wasn't ever really his. Tully came forward. He had the decency, or the practical wisdom, to do it quickly and without theater. 2 words. Hale stood up. His hands were cuffed before he'd had time to fully process that it was happening. The room did not cheer. It wasn't that kind of room, or those kinds of people. What happened was a long collective exhale. The sound of a community releasing something it had been holding, quietly and without much choice, for a long time. Margaret Cade had her hands pressed together in her lap, and her eyes were wet, and she was looking at the window rather than at anyone specific. And Elena thought about Tom Cade dying angry and quiet about something that now, finally, had been answered. Chester Ames let out a long, shaking breath. Marta, at the wall, had her arms crossed, and her expression was the expression of someone who is not surprised and is allowing themselves to be relieved anyway. Cross, at the back of the room, was looking at Elena. She looked back at him across the length of the room and all the people between them, and she felt the weight of the leather satchel in her lap. The original documents, all of them, the 6 months of work and the journey that had started in a Cheyenne archive and ended here, in a hotel room in Blackridge Crossing, with a man in handcuffs and a judge's ruling that her father's land was his again. Her hand was on the accounting ledger, his handwriting throughout, his signature, real and specific, and his, at the bottom of 20 years of honest work. She kept her hand on it until the room started to move around her, and the moment passed into the next one, where there were still things to do and arrangements to make, and a territorial prosecutor's office to correspond with, and the long, ordinary work of whatever came after this. She picked up her satchel and stood up. The stage left Blackridge Crossing on Thursday mornings. Elena knew this because she'd confirmed the schedule 3 separate times in her first week, knowing the exit was a practical matter when you were operating in a place that might decide to make your exit for you. She knew the schedule. She'd never bought a ticket. The Thursday after Alderman's ruling, she stood at the window of the back room and watched the stage pull out of town without her on it, and she felt something settle that she hadn't been expecting. Not relief exactly, something quieter than that. The feeling of a person who has stopped moving long enough to discover they might want to stay where they've stopped. There was still work. There was always still work. The Territorial Prosecutor's Office had sent a deputy within 4 days of Alderman's referral, a young man named Garrett, who was efficient and slightly overwhelmed by the volume of documentation Elena handed him, and who spent 2 full days in the back room of the saloon going through everything with the systematic attention of someone determined not to miss anything. She walked him through the evidence index. She answered his questions. She made sure he understood the railroad connection and the Meridian land holdings thread, and she gave him Chester Ames wire logs with the specific instruction that the Denver end of it needed a federal inquiry, not just a territorial one, because whatever was on the other side of those wires didn't stop at the border of one circuit judge's jurisdiction. Garrett wrote everything down and thanked her with the genuine gratitude of someone who'd been handed a case already built and knew it. Victor Hale remained in county custody pending formal charges. His properties were frozen pending the outcome of the fraud proceedings. The First Territorial Bank in Pueblo, as Cross had predicted, had already sent a letter to the county clerk's office requesting clarification on the status of 3 outstanding mortgage instruments, which was the financial equivalent of a man quietly stepping away from a burning building before anyone could ask him why he'd been standing so close to it. Meridian Land Holdings, when the federal inquiry finally reached Denver 6 weeks later, turned out to be a holding vehicle shared between Hale and a deputy commissioner on the Territorial Railroad Authority, a man named Edgar Foss, who had resigned his position before the investigator from the land office arrived at his door, which was either coincidence or the result of someone tipping him off, and that question was someone else's problem now. Elena had done what she'd come to do. She couldn't do everything. The 4 families whose properties had been restored, the surviving ones, came to Blackridge Crossing over the following weeks in 1s and 2s, some from other counties, one from as far as New Mexico. They came to sign the re-registration documents. They came to look at land they'd thought they'd lost. One man, a rancher named Walt Dempsey, who'd lost his creek frontage in 1880 and moved his family to his wife's parents' place in Colorado Springs, walked the boundary of his restored property alone for about 2 hours before he came back and sat on the front steps of the Cross and Timber and asked Marta for a beer and didn't say much for a long time. Marta brought him the beer and didn't ask questions, which was the correct response. Elena watched from the window of the back room, which had become, by degrees, her room, the room where she worked, the room where she thought, the room that had a scorch mark on the floor that Cross had covered with a rug and never mentioned again. She'd stopped thinking of it as a temporary arrangement. The office opened on a Tuesday, 6 weeks after the hearing. It was in the building that had been her father's, the property restored by Alderman's ruling, a modest 2-story structure on the south end of Main Street that had been used as a warehouse by the man Hale had installed in it. Elena had spent 2 weeks cleaning it out and another week deciding what to do with it. And the decision she arrived at was the one that had been building in the back of her mind since she'd first spread Tom Cade's survey notebooks across Margaret Cade's sitting room table and understood that the problem here wasn't just Victor Hale. The problem was that ordinary people, settlers, ranchers, widows, anyone without legal training, had no reliable way to understand the documents that controlled their lives. The contracts they signed, the deeds they filed, the registrations they submitted in good faith to offices that might or might not be operating in good faith. They handed their futures to systems they couldn't read and trusted those systems to work the way they were supposed to. And when the systems were broken or bent, they had no way to know until it was too late. That was the opening that men like Hale moved through. Not genius, not particular cunning, just the gap between what ordinary people knew and what they needed to know. She put a sign over the door, hand-lettered, plain, Mercer Land and Legal Records, consultation for settlers and property owners. No flourishes. The sign said what the office was. Margaret Cade had helped her arrange the interior, 2 desks, a shelf for reference volumes, a table large enough for survey maps to be laid out and read properly. Margaret had also, without being asked, made curtains for the windows, which Elena had not been planning to address, and which made the office look less like a storage room and more like a place where someone intended to work for a long time. "You didn't have to do that," Elena told her. "I know," Margaret said. "The curtains were in my spare room and they weren't doing anything." She looked at the shelves. "You're going to need more reference volumes. Tom had land law references I never knew what to do with. I'll bring them tomorrow." She brought 7 volumes the next morning, which filled the shelf considerably and gave the office the specific quality of a place that took itself seriously. The first person who came through the door that Tuesday wasn't a settler or a rancher. It was Silas Pruitt. He stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at the room with an expression Elena couldn't immediately read. He was wearing his work coat, the old, carefully maintained one, and he had his hat in his hands in the way people hold hats when they're uncertain of their reception. "Mr. Pruitt," Elena said. "Miss Mercer." He looked at the shelves, the desks, the maps laid out on the large table. You're staying. I'm staying. He turned his hat in his hands. I wanted to. He stopped. Started again, which was a pattern she'd noticed in him, the careful man's habit of rejecting his first phrasing and trying for a more accurate one. I wanted to say that what you did here mattered, not just for your father's property, for, he gestured, a small movement that encompassed something larger than the room, for the way things work here, or the way they'll work now. You helped do that, she said. Your testimony was what held it together. He shook his head slightly. You built the case. I just told the truth once I ran out of reasons not to. That's not a small thing, she said. Running out of reasons not to tell the truth and then telling it anyway. That's not nothing, Silas. He looked at her. Something in his face that had been tight for the entire time she'd known him, a held quality, like a door braced against pressure, had eased slightly. There's a question, he said, about my position. The county commissioner's office has to decide whether to retain me given the nature of what I testified to. He paused. I don't know which way they'll decide. If they don't retain you, Elena said, I need someone who understands county registration protocol to help with what I'm building here. The work requires someone who knows how the filing system actually functions, not just how it's supposed to function. Pruitt looked at her for a long moment. You're offering me a job, he said. I'm saying the conversation is available if you need it, she said. Whatever the commissioner's office decides. He nodded slowly. He put his hat back on. I'll let you know, he said, and left with the same measured pace he'd always used, and Elena watched him go and thought that whatever he decided would probably be the right decision, because a man who'd finally told the truth after 5 years of not telling it was going to make his subsequent decisions differently than he'd made the ones before. Cross came by the office on the third day. He looked at the sign over the door for a moment before he came in, and he looked at the interior with the specific attention he gave to things, the completing the thought look, the one she'd cataloged early and thought about more than she'd intended to. It looks like a real office, he said. It is a real office. He walked to the shelf of reference volumes and read a few spines. Tom Cade's land law references, he said. Margaret brought them. Of course she did. He turned and looked at the room again, the desks, the map table, the curtains that made it look like someone planned to stay. You're going to be busy. I'm already busy, she said. Walt Dempsey came in yesterday with 3 contracts he'd signed over the past 4 years that he'd never had anyone review. 2 of them have provisions he didn't understand when he signed them and wouldn't have agreed to if he had. What provisions? One gives the other party rights of first refusal on his water access if he defaults on a payment. The other has an automatic renewal clause that he can't exit without a penalty that amounts to 6 months of his income. She set her pen down. He didn't know. He's a rancher. He knows cattle and land. He signed documents because the other party told him to sign them, and he trusted that the terms were what he'd been told they were. Cross was quiet. How many people in this county have signed documents they didn't understand? She said. It wasn't a rhetorical question, exactly. It was the question she'd been sitting with since the day she'd arrived and started understanding the scale of what Hale had built. Not because they were deceived every time, sometimes just because no one ever explained what the words meant. A lot of people, Cross said. Yes. She picked up her pen again. So I'm going to be busy. He sat in the chair across from her desk, the visitor's chair, which she'd brought from the saloon's back room and which Cross had let her take without comment. He sat in it and looked at her with the expression she'd come to understand was him arriving at something he'd been thinking about for a while. I want to say something, he said. She waited. The night you came in on the stage, he said. I wasn't planning to be involved in whatever you were doing. I was going to stay out of it, the way I've stayed out of most things for 10 years. He looked at the window, then back at her. I stood up in the saloon because of what I said. It's my place. What happens there is my business. That part was true. But, she said, but there was also... He stopped, made the same effort Pruitt made, rejecting the first phrasing. I recognized something. The way you were sitting there with the folder on the table, not performing anything, not trying to look like you weren't afraid, just doing the next thing that needed doing, even though you were clearly afraid. He paused. I recognized that. She looked at him. From what? From a version of myself I used to be, he said. Before I decided that the cost of being involved in things was too high to keep paying, she considered that. What changed your mind? About the cost? He looked at her for a long enough moment that she thought he wasn't going to answer. You did, he said. Simple. Factual. No decoration on it. She set her pen down again. The office was quiet except for the sound of the main street outside. Horses, voices, the ordinary noise of a town going about its business in the October afternoon. The same sounds she'd been hearing for 6 weeks, grown familiar in the way that sounds become familiar when you stop noticing them consciously because you're home. She'd been thinking about that word for the past 2 weeks. Home. What it meant. Whether it was a place or a decision, or some combination of the two that you couldn't separate once they'd been made together. I found something in this town besides what I came looking for, she said. What? People worth being around. She said it without excessive weight. That's not nothing. I've been in enough places to know it's not common. Cross looked at her with an expression that was the quietest version of the thing she'd been watching build in his face over 6 weeks. A slow opening, like a window in a house that's been closed for a long time, the air coming in cautiously at first. I'm not easy to be around, he said. I should tell you that clearly. I've noticed, she said. I've been alone a long time. I know. That changes how a person... He stopped. I don't always... Cross, she said. He stopped. I spent 6 months eating meals by myself while I chased evidence across 2 territories, she said. I'm also not easy to be around. I work too much, and I think about land records at dinner, and I argue about things that most people don't consider worth arguing about. She met his eyes. I'm not looking for easy. He was quiet for a moment. What are you looking for? He said. She thought about how to answer that honestly. Something real, she said. Something that I built instead of inherited. Work that matters, and people who mean what they say. She looked at the office around her, her father's building, the shelf of reference volumes, the map table, the curtains Margaret had brought because she thought they were needed. I think I'm looking at most of it. Cross looked at her for a long time. Then he stood up from the visitor's chair and walked around the desk. And she stood up because sitting while he was standing felt like the wrong arrangement. And he was close enough that she could see the tiredness in his face that had been there since the night of the fire and hadn't quite left. And also the other thing. The thing that had been building quietly alongside everything else. He didn't say anything else. He put his hand against the side of her face, carefully, on the side that hadn't been bruised, or that had been bruised and healed. And she let him. And that was its own kind of answer to a question neither of them had asked out loud. Winter came to Blackridge Crossing the way it always did in the territory, without much announcement, the temperature dropping over a week until one morning the water in the basin was cold enough to make your hands ache. The office stayed open through it. Elena had a small stove installed in the corner, which helped, and Margaret brought a rug for the floor that had previously been in her spare room and apparently had no other purpose. The reference shelf gained 4 more volumes, 2 of which Chester Ames donated, territorial land law references he'd had for years and never expected to use. Chester had kept his job at the telegraph office, partly because the new county commissioner who'd been appointed in the reorganization following Hale's arrest had decided that a wire operator who maintained meticulous personal logs was a professional asset rather than a liability. Chester came in on a Tuesday afternoon in November and set the volumes on the shelf and stood looking at the office with the expression of a man who'd spent 2 months still expecting consequences that hadn't arrived. It's actually working, he said. The office. Did you think it wouldn't? I thought... He looked at the window at the street outside. I thought things would go back to the way they were. After the hearing, after the... He searched for the word. After the drama of it settled. I thought Blackridge Crossing would go back to being a place where certain things were understood to be fixed. Some things are fixed, Elena said. Some things that felt fixed were just undisturbed. He thought about that. What's the difference? Fixed means it can't move. Undisturbed means no one's pushed it yet. She looked at the reference shelf. Hale's system wasn't fixed. It was just undisturbed. Once someone started pushing, you, Chester said, and Pruitt, and Margaret, and Marta, and you. She looked at him. You gave me the wire logs. He stood with his hands in his coat pockets, still with that expression, waiting for something to fall. What happens if someone like Hale comes back, he said. Not him specifically, someone who does the same thing differently, who finds the next gap. It was, she thought, the right question. Not the comfortable question, not the one that allowed you to feel that the story was over and the problem was solved. The right question, the honest one, the one that acknowledged that Victor Hale was one instance of a pattern rather than the pattern itself. Then we find it faster, she said, because more people know what to look for, because the records are better organized and better understood, and because there are people in this county now who know what a suspicious gap in a protocol sequence looks like and why it matters. She looked at him steadily. That's not a guarantee, but it's a different starting position than the one we were in. Chester nodded slowly. He didn't look entirely reassured, which was fine. Incomplete reassurance was honest. The world didn't come with guarantees, and anyone who offered them was selling something. He left. She went back to work. On a Thursday in early December, Silas Pruitt came back to the office. The county commissioner's office had retained him. He told her that 2 weeks prior, with the flat delivery of a man relaying information rather than celebrating it. He'd also told her that he'd spent the intervening time reorganizing the registry filing system, implementing a redundant logging protocol, cross-referenced, with a separate public index that couldn't be altered without both copies reflecting the change. It won't prevent everything, he'd said. Nothing prevents everything, she'd said. Does it make it harder? Considerably. Then it's worth doing. He came in that December Thursday and sat across from her desk without preamble, the way people sat who'd stopped being uncertain of their welcome. There's a woman on 5th Street, he said. Name is Clara Dent. She's a widow, been here 3 years. She signed a contract last spring for water rights to a seasonal creek that runs through her property. The other party to the contract is claiming the water rights transfer annually rather than permanently, which isn't what the contract says. He looked at Elena. She can't afford legal representation in the territorial capital. She doesn't know what her contract says well enough to argue it. Elena looked at him. Send her in, she said. Clara Dent arrived an hour later. A woman in her mid-40s with the weathered competence of someone who'd been managing a loan for long enough that a loan had stopped feeling like a condition and started feeling like a method. She sat across from Elena with her contract in her lap, slightly crumpled from being handled and rehandled, and she looked at Elena with the specific expression of someone who has been told their problem might have a solution and isn't sure yet whether to trust that. Elena took the contract and read it carefully. The transfer is permanent, she said. It's not clearly written. There's ambiguous language in Section 3 that the other party is exploiting, but the intent and the legal effect of the contract as written is permanent transfer. She set it on the desk between them and put her finger on the relevant section. Here. This clause. The word seasonal modifies the creek, not the rights. It's describing the type of water source, not the duration of the transfer. Clara looked at the contract, at Elena's finger on the clause, at the words. I didn't understand it when I signed it, she said. Not ashamed, just factual. Most people wouldn't, Elena said. The language is deliberately ambiguous. The person who drafted this knew what they were doing. She looked at Clara. I'll write you a formal interpretation document, 3 pages, plain language, explaining exactly what this contract means and why. If the other party continues to claim the water rights revert annually, you take my document to the county registrar's office and file it as a clarifying addendum to the original contract. If they push further, that document is your foundation for a complaint. How much? Clara started. Nothing, Elena said. Clara looked at her. The office charges for commercial consultations, Elena said. Settlers and individual property owners. I work with what they can manage. She picked up her pen. What I charge is that if someone else comes to you in the same position, someone who doesn't know where to go, you tell them about this office. Clara was quiet for a moment. That's your whole payment? It's the payment that compounds, Elena said. It was the model she had arrived at over the first 6 weeks. Not charity, not commerce, but something with a different logic. The people who could least afford legal confusion were the ones most vulnerable to it, and charging them market rate solved one problem while creating another. What she needed wasn't payment in the immediate sense. She needed the word to travel. She needed the next Clara Dent to know there was somewhere to go before the contract had already been signed under disadvantageous terms. Clara left with her interpretation document, which Elena had written out in the hour after she'd reviewed the contract. Clear, specific, with the relevant clauses numbered and explained in language that assumed intelligence rather than legal knowledge. She watched Clara walk down the main street with the document folded carefully in her coat pocket, and she thought about how many thousands of people in the territories were walking around right now with contracts in their pockets that they didn't fully understand, signed in good faith, trusting systems and people who might or might not deserve that trust. It was an enormous problem. She was one person with a two-desk office and a shelf of reference volumes. That gap between the scale of the problem and the scale of what she could do about it was not something she'd resolved. She wasn't sure it could be resolved. What she decided was that the gap being large didn't mean you stood on one side of it and stayed there. It meant you built what you could build and trusted that what you built would teach someone else to build something adjacent to it, and that eventually the aggregate of many small things became something larger than any individual effort. Her father had believed something like that. He'd surveyed land, measurement by measurement, one property at a time, and he'd believed that accurate measurement done faithfully over time produced a record that future people could rely on. He hadn't been trying to change the world. He'd been trying to do his work correctly. She was trying to do her work correctly. It turned out that was the same thing, done long enough, in the right place. The evening Cross came by to walk her home, a habit that had developed without either of them acknowledging it as a habit. He stopped at the door of the office and looked at the sign over it in the last light. "It needs better lettering," he said. "The lettering is fine. The letters are uneven." "The letters convey the information," she said, pulling the door shut behind her. "The unevenness gives it character." He looked at her sideways. "Character. I did it myself," she said, late at night with a brush that was slightly too large. "It has character." He almost smiled. The full version, not the tired adjacent one. The one that had been appearing more frequently over the past weeks, and that she'd stopped pretending she didn't notice. They walked down the main street in the early winter dark, past the hardware merchant whose door was just closing, past the boarding house where a lamp burned in Margaret Cade's front window, past the telegraph office where Chester Ames was still at his desk at this hour, because he'd apparently always been a man who worked late, and had finally found a reason to feel all right about it. Cross put his hand at the small of her back as they crossed the uneven board at the edge of the street. A practical gesture, steadying, the kind that didn't announce itself. She thought about her father's accounting ledger, which was in the office now, on the shelf beside Tom Cade's land law references and the survey notebooks. She'd put it there deliberately, not as a memorial. He wouldn't have wanted that. As a working document. As the kind of record that reminded anyone who looked at it what honest work actually looked like, done over time, without shortcuts. The bruise on her face was long gone. Sometimes she forgot it had been there, and then she'd catch herself in the mirror and remember the night she'd walked into that saloon with her documents and her anger and her 6 months of careful preparation, and a man had hit her in front of 40 people who'd found their boots very interesting. She didn't forgive him for it. Forgiveness wasn't the point, and she wasn't built for the kind of performance that involved calling something you'd endured a gift. What she had instead was something more durable, the understanding that it had not stopped her, that she had sat there in the aftermath, shaking slightly, and gathered her papers off the floor and gotten back to work. That was the thing she'd learned, or that she'd confirmed, that fear and damage and the specific weight of being in a place that doesn't want you can be survived if you keep doing the next thing. Not bravely, not perfectly, just persistently. One document at a time, one question at a time, one conversation at a time. Until the thing you came to do is done, and the thing you didn't know you were building is standing in front of you. Blackridge Crossing was not a different town than it had been 6 weeks ago. The same people lived in it. The same winters came. The same problems of land and water and contract and trust existed and would go on existing, because that was what human settlements were, places where people's competing interests required some form of honest arbitration to keep from collapsing into the kind of arrangement that rewarded whoever hit hardest. What was different was small and specific. There was a 2-desk office on Main Street with uneven sign lettering where a person who didn't understand a contract could go and have it explained to them in plain language by someone who wasn't going to take advantage of the explanation. That was all. It wasn't a revolution. It wasn't the end of anything. It was a beginning, and beginnings were enough. They were, in fact, the only thing that ever actually changed anything. Not grand conclusions, but small, persistent starts, one after another, until the accumulation of them added up to something that looked from a distance like progress. She walked home in the dark with her hand in crosses, and the sign with its uneven letters was behind her, and the office with its reference shelf and its map table and its scorch mark covered by a rug was behind her. And somewhere on that shelf, her father's accounting ledger sat beside the land law volumes in the quiet, doing the only thing a good record can do once it's been made honest again. Waiting to be useful.
Quick key. I got a key.
It's a cocktail lounge downtown. Is it the one next to Copper Tap? Or whatever the fuck that place is called? Oh, something happened with Chandler. No, it's right by the marina. Oh, I don't know where that is. A bit down from the corner pocket. Where's corner pocket? What's that fucking sound? That's the baby. Ben's a father now. You've been there. To the Outlaw? Or Corner Pocket? I remember where Corner Pocket was. I just don't know where this Outlaw place. Is it where that glass blowing place used to be? Near the old people home?
What the fuck is that noise? Oh my god. He's gonna ooze on me. Keep your gunk away from me, foul beast.
No, I just can't see. I still can't see. I can't see.
Oh no. Oh no. Oh hell no.
What's happening with Ben?
Bro, what the fuck?
What happened?
Man? Fucking spider just walked up to me.
Dude, why does it Chandler teleport anybody, bro? We have to get a new fucking guy. Oh, I gotta go there next. Dude, we gotta get a new base bitch because Chandler's just not gonna fucking cut it, bro. I'm just not gonna lie. How the fuck has he not thought to teleport anybody, bro?
We need a damn shovel.
Dude, we need a fucking better base bitch. Dude, he could have saved me so easily. If there's a red dot on my head, could he not make a fucking assumption? Oh my god, man.
Oh shit. He run away, run away. No, he's dead. Oh, he's in TP.
Oh my god, he fucking did it!
Good TP, good TP!
Oh my god, he saved one of us. 1 out of 3. That's an almost passing.
How much time is there?
I don't know.
What is he doing?
There's a sandworm out there.
Big red thing by us. Look at it. Look at the thing.
Sandworm.
Can hear it, yeah. We don't have enough, so I gotta go back.
He's just gotta depot the stuff we already have.
Yeah. Did it just make a noise when he hit it?
Yeah, what the fuck?
What the fuck? I wonder if the kidnapper fox is gonna get Chandler. I'm surprised it hasn't tried to jump him yet.